Hello, and welcome to Cowboy Heart Stories. Tonight, I want to share a story that began with a forced marriage on the wild frontier. And somewhere within this story, you might just find a piece of your own heart. The shotgun pressed against Ethan Walker's spine wasn't nearly as cold as the banker's smile. Sign the marriage certificate, Walker, or watch your ranch go to auction tomorrow morning. In the dusty Colorado church, Clara Whitmore stood frozen at the altar, the town's unwanted spinster about to become a rancher's unwilling bride. Neither knew that this forced union would ignite the most passionate love story the frontier had ever witnessed. Welcome to a tale where enemies become lovers, and a marriage of desperation transforms into destiny. I'm sharing this story from Denver, Colorado. Comment below where you're watching from, and let's see how far our story travels today. The morning of August 15, 1881, dawned with an oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the small town of Silver Creek, Colorado. The air hung thick and still, as if nature itself held its breath for what was about to unfold in the weathered wooden church at the center of Main Street. Ethan Walker stood before the altar, his calloused hands clenched into fists at his sides. At 32, he cut an imposing figure, 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle earned from years of working his ranch, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of winter storm clouds. Those eyes, which once held warmth and laughter, now blazed with barely contained fury as he stared at the cross hanging above the altar. "This is wrong," he muttered under his breath, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Behind him, Harold Morrison, the town's banker and self-appointed moral authority, cleared his throat. "Wrong or right doesn't matter much when you're 3 months behind on your loan payments, does it, Walker?" The banker's voice dripped with false sympathy. "You should be thanking me for arranging this solution. Not many men would be so generous." Ethan's hands tightened further, his knuckles white. Generous. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Morrison had cornered him 2 days ago with an ultimatum that still rang in his ears. Marry Clara Whitmore, the town's spinster schoolteacher, or lose everything his late wife Margaret had helped him build. "Margaret's barely been in the ground 8 months," Ethan had protested in Morrison's office, his voice raw with grief and rage. "And that's 8 months too long for a motherless child to be running wild," Morrison had countered, his thin lips curving into what passed for a smile. "Little Sophie needs a woman's influence. The whole town's been talking about it. Besides, Miss Whitmore's situation is, shall we say, equally desperate. Her position at the school is being reconsidered, given her advanced age and unmarried status. 28 and still unwed. It's unseemly for someone teaching our impressionable young ladies." The banker had leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled like a spider contemplating its web. "Marry her, Walker, and I'll extend your loan by 6 months. Give you time to get the ranch back on its feet. Miss Whitmore keeps her respectability, your daughter gets a mother, and you keep your land. Everyone wins." Everyone wins. Ethan wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Nobody was winning today, least of all the woman being forced to bind herself to a man who didn't want her. The church door creaked open, and Ethan's thoughts scattered like startled crows. He didn't turn around, but he could hear the whispers ripple through the small gathering of townspeople who'd come to witness this spectacle. Silver Creek loved nothing more than a scandal, and this forced marriage had given them enough gossip to last through winter. "She's here," someone whispered. "Poor thing, having to marry beneath her station," another voice murmured. "Better than dying an old maid," came the sharp retort. Ethan's jaw clenched tighter. He could hear the rustle of fabric as Clara Whitmore made her way down the aisle. Still, he didn't turn. He couldn't bear to see the resignation that must surely be written across her face, a mirror of his own. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Silver Creek 3 years ago from Boston, a mystery wrapped in proper Eastern manners and elegant speech. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5 feet 8 inches, with rich auburn hair she kept severely pinned and green eyes that seemed to see through people's pretenses. The townsfolk had initially been charmed by her education and refinement, but as the months passed without any suitors calling, whispers began. Too proud, they said, too educated. What man wanted a wife who'd read more books than he had? Probably scared them all off with that sharp tongue of hers, Ethan had once heard Mrs. Patterson say at the general store. He'd defended her then, oddly enough. "Nothing wrong with a woman who speaks her mind," he'd said, thinking of Margaret, who'd never been afraid to tell him when he was being a fool. Now, as Clara's footsteps drew closer, he wondered if he'd live to regret those words. The pastor, Reverend Mills, shifted uncomfortably at the altar. The old man's kind face was creased with concern as he watched the proceedings. This wasn't the first forced marriage he'd performed, but something about this one seemed to trouble him more than usual. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice lacking its usual warmth, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Ethan Walker and Clara Whitmore in holy matrimony." The words fell into the church like stones into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through everyone present. This was no joyous occasion. It was a business transaction dressed in white lace and hollow vows. Finally, Ethan turned to face his bride. Clara stood beside him in a simple gray dress. Not white, he noted with grim appreciation. At least she wasn't pretending this was something it wasn't. Her face was pale but composed, her chin lifted with a dignity that made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. She didn't look at him, keeping her gaze fixed on some point past the pastor's shoulder. Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, probably picked hastily from the roadside on her way here. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman backed into a corner with nowhere else to run. Just like him. "Miss Whitmore," Reverend Mills said gently, "do you come here of your own free will?" Clara's lips parted, and for a moment Ethan thought she might actually say no. The church held its collective breath. Then, in a voice steady as granite, she said, "I do." The lie hung in the air between them like smoke from a snuffed candle. "And you, Mr. Walker?" Ethan's throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. "I do." Another lie. They were building their marriage on a foundation of falsehoods, and everyone knew it. As Reverend Mills continued with the ceremony, Ethan found himself studying Clara from the corner of his eye. She was handsome rather than pretty, with strong features that would age well. Her hands, he noticed, bore small scars and calluses. Not the soft, pampered hands he'd expected from a Boston lady. There was a story there, he realized, one he'd never bothered to learn. "The rings?" Reverend Mills prompted. Ethan fumbled in his pocket for the simple gold band he'd bought that morning, the cheapest Henderson's general store had to offer. It was nothing like the ring he'd given Margaret, which he'd saved for months to afford. This one was thin, plain, and would probably turn Clara's finger green within a week. Clara had no ring for him. Of course she didn't. She'd probably been informed of this marriage at the same time he had, 2 days ago, with no time to prepare, no time to run. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, their hands touched for the first time. Hers were ice cold despite the heat of the day. She flinched at the contact so slightly that only he noticed, but it was enough to make his stomach turn with self-loathing. What kind of man had he become, forcing a woman to marry him? "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Mills said, though he looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Ethan turned to Clara, meeting her eyes for the first time. They were green, yes, but not the simple green he'd thought. They were the color of sage in the morning light, flecked with gold and rimmed with darker forest green. And in them he saw not fear or sadness, but something that surprised him: defiance. She lifted her chin slightly, as if daring him to kiss her, to seal this farce with an intimacy neither of them wanted. He leaned in, meaning to brush his lips against her cheek, the minimum required to satisfy the ceremony. But at the last moment she turned her head, and his lips grazed the corner of her mouth instead. The contact was brief, barely a whisper of touch, but it sent an unexpected jolt through him like lightning striking dry prairie grass. Clara pulled back immediately, her cheeks flushing pink. "It's done then," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "We're bound. Bound, like prisoners, like animals in a trap." The small congregation offered scattered, uncomfortable applause as they turned to face them. Mrs. Patterson was already whispering to Mrs. Henderson, no doubt commenting on Clara's dress or the brevity of the kiss. The men looked anywhere but at Ethan, probably thinking of their own wives, their own choices. Grateful they weren't standing in his boots. Morrison stood near the back, his satisfaction evident in every line of his corpulent frame. He nodded once at Ethan, a reminder of who held the real power here. "Shall we?" Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. She didn't take his arm, instead walking beside him down the aisle with a foot of space between them. Might as well have been a canyon. Outside the church, the sun beat down mercilessly. Ethan's wagon waited, loaded with supplies from his monthly trip to town. His horse, Zeus, stamped impatiently, eager to return to the ranch. In the back of the wagon sat a small trunk, all of Clara's worldly possessions, he realized with a start. Her entire life reduced to what could fit in a wooden box. "Your things," he started. "That's all of it," she said crisply. "The boarding house was quite eager to see me gone. Apparently having an unwed female teacher as a tenant was becoming problematic for their reputation." The bitterness in her voice was sharp enough to cut. Ethan helped her up onto the wagon seat. She accepted his hand reluctantly, dropping it the moment she was settled. As he walked around to the other side, he caught sight of a small figure peering out from behind the general store. Sophie, his daughter, 6 years old and all knees and elbows, with Margaret's corn silk hair and his gray eyes. She'd refused to come to the ceremony, had thrown such a tantrum that he'd left her with Mrs. Henderson rather than force her. Now she watched them with eyes full of betrayal and confusion. "Papa?" she called out, her voice small and uncertain. "Sophie, come here," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle despite the turmoil in his chest. She shook her head violently, blonde braids whipping around her face. "No, she's not my mama. My mama's in heaven and she's coming back. She promised she'd never leave me." Clara stiffened beside him but said nothing. "Sophie, please." But his daughter had already turned and run, disappearing behind the buildings. Mrs. Henderson emerged a moment later, shaking her head. "I'll keep her for another hour or two, give you time to settle things at home." Settle things. As if anything about this situation could be settled. The ride to the ranch was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snort from Zeus. Clara sat ramrod straight beside him, her hands folded in her lap, gripping each other so tightly her knuckles were white. The wedding ring caught the sunlight, looking as out of place on her finger as she looked sitting beside him. The Double W Ranch, named for Walker and his late wife's maiden name, Williams, sat 15 miles outside of Silver Creek, nestled in a valley between two ridges that provided shelter from the worst of the winter winds. It wasn't the largest ranch in the county, but it had good water rights and prime grazing land. Or it had been prime before the drought last summer killed half his cattle and left him drowning in debt. As they crested the final hill, the ranch spread out before them. The main house was modest but sturdy, built from local timber with a stone foundation. Margaret had insisted on the wraparound porch, saying a home needed a place to watch sunsets and welcome visitors. Now the porch looked empty, forlorn, like it was waiting for someone who would never come home. "It's beautiful," Clara said quietly, surprising him. He glanced at her. "It needs work. Haven't had time for repairs since—" He stopped, unwilling to finish the sentence. "Since your wife died," Clara completed for him, her tone matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. Mr. Morrison explained the situation quite thoroughly. Your wife's death, your debts, your need for someone to care for your daughter. He made it clear that this arrangement benefits us both. "And does it?" The question came out harsher than he intended. "Benefit you?" Clara turned to look at him fully for the first time since the ceremony. "I suppose that depends on your definition of benefit, Mr. Walker. I keep my position, avoid the shame of being dismissed for the crime of being unmarried, and gain a roof over my head that doesn't come with daily reminders of my failure to secure a husband through conventional means. Whether that constitutes a benefit or merely a different form of imprisonment remains to be seen." Her honesty was brutal, refreshing, and somehow exactly what he needed to hear. At least they weren't going to pretend. "Then we understand each other," he said. "I believe we do." As they pulled up to the house, Ethan saw the curtains twitch in the front window. Mrs. Molly O'Brien, his housekeeper, peered out with undisguised curiosity. He'd sent word ahead about the marriage. No point in shocking the poor woman entirely, but he could imagine the thoughts running through her head. Molly emerged onto the porch as they stopped, her weathered face carefully neutral. She was a widow herself, had been working for them since Sophie was born. She'd been Margaret's friend, and Ethan knew this sudden marriage must feel like a betrayal to her too. Mr. Walker, she said, nodding. Then to Clara, Mrs. Walker. Clara flinched at the title but recovered quickly. Please, call me Clara. I suspect we'll be working closely together, and formality seems unnecessary. Molly's eyebrows rose slightly. If you wish, ma'am. The ma'am was pointed, a subtle reminder of boundaries. Clara, to her credit, didn't react. Ethan helped Clara down from the wagon, again noting how she pulled away from his touch as soon as possible. Molly, would you show Clara to her room? Her room? Molly looked confused. But I prepared the master bedroom. The spare room, Ethan said firmly. The one at the end of the hall. Understanding dawned in Molly's eyes, followed by something that might have been pity. Of course, Mr. Walker. This way, ma'am. Clara followed Molly into the house, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the bitter taste of his new reality. He unhitched Zeus, his movements automatic after years of practice, trying not to think about how different this homecoming was from what he'd imagined. When he'd married Margaret, they'd barely made it through the front door before he'd swept her into his arms, both of them laughing as he carried her over the threshold. They'd been young, in love, full of dreams about the life they'd build together. Now those dreams were buried with her in the cemetery on the hill, and he was left with this hollow substitute. Inside, the house felt different already. Clara's presence, though she'd only been there minutes, seemed to change the very air. He could hear Molly's voice from upstairs, explaining the household routines, and Clara's quiet responses. Professional, distant, proper, everything this marriage would be. The spare room Molly was showing Clara had been meant for the additional children he and Margaret had planned. They talked about filling the house with laughter, maybe 3 or 4 little ones running through the halls. Margaret had even started a quilt for the next baby, soft yellow and white squares that now lay forgotten in a trunk in the attic. Papa? He turned to find Sophie standing in the doorway, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Mrs. Henderson stood behind her, looking apologetic. She insisted on coming home, Mrs. Henderson explained. Wouldn't settle. Thank you for trying, Ethan said, his heart breaking at the sight of his daughter's distress. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sophie flew into his arms, her small body shaking with sobs. Why, Papa, why did you bring her here? This is Mama's house. Sophie, sweetheart, no. She pulled back, her gray eyes flashing with anger that looked disturbingly adult on her young face. You promised we'd be okay, just the 2 of us. You lied. Before he could respond, she'd wrenched away and run up the stairs. He heard her bedroom door slam, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Children adjust, Clara's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her standing at the foot of the stairs, having changed from her wedding dress into a simple blue work dress. It will take time, but they adjust. Speaking from experience? The question came out more sarcastically than he'd intended. As a matter of fact, yes. Her chin lifted. I've taught dozens of children, Mr. Walker. I've seen them weather far worse storms than a new stepmother. You're not her mother. The words were cruel, meant to wound, and he saw them hit their mark. Clara's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of pain crossing her features before she rebuilt her walls. No, she agreed quietly. I'm not, and I won't pretend to be. But I am here, and I am now your wife, whether either of us likes it or not. We can make this situation bearable, or we can make it a misery. The choice is yours. She turned and walked into the kitchen, her back straight, leaving him standing alone in the hallway of his own home, feeling like a stranger. Dinner that evening was a disaster. Molly had prepared a fine meal, roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans from the garden, but it might as well have been sawdust. Sophie refused to come down, despite Ethan's repeated calls. Clara sat at Margaret's place at the table, though she'd tried to take a different chair before Molly had firmly directed her to the foot of the table opposite Ethan. It's your place now, Molly had said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely approve. They ate in silence, the clink of silverware against plates unnaturally loud. Clara cut her food into precise, small pieces, chewing each bite thoroughly. Her manners were impeccable, her posture perfect. Everything about her screamed refinement and education, so different from Margaret's easy, natural grace. The chicken is excellent, Mrs. O'Brien, Clara finally said. Thank you, ma'am. More silence. I understand you have a library, Clara ventured, looking at Ethan. He nearly choked on his potato. A library? Mr. Morrison mentioned you had books. I thought perhaps a few shelves in the study, nothing fancy. He didn't mention that most of them had been Margaret's, that he hadn't been able to bring himself to even enter the study since her death. I see. Would you mind if I do whatever you want? The words came out harsh, dismissive. He saw her flinch slightly, saw Molly's disapproving look, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. This is your home now, after all. Clara set down her fork carefully. Mr. Walker, I understand this situation is not what either of us would have chosen, but taking your anger out on me serves no purpose. I didn't force you to marry me any more than you forced me. We are both victims of circumstance, and I would appreciate it if you could remember that. Her words were calm, measured, but there was steel beneath them. Ethan felt properly chastised, like a schoolboy caught pulling pigtails. You're right, he admitted grudgingly. My apologies. She nodded, picking up her fork again. Perhaps we should establish some ground rules for coexistence. Such as, we maintain separate rooms as you've already arranged. We present a united front in public for appearance's sake. In private, we need not pretend affection we don't feel. I will fulfill the duties of running the household and caring for Sophie, should she allow it. You continue running the ranch. We stay out of each other's way as much as possible. It sounded cold, clinical, like a business contract, which Ethan supposed was exactly what their marriage was. And Sophie? I won't force myself on her. Children can't be rushed in matters of the heart. But I will be here, consistently, patiently, until she's ready to accept my presence. That could take a very long time. Then it takes a very long time. Clara met his gaze steadily. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Walker. This marriage may be a prison for both of us, but I intend to make the best of it. I've survived worse situations with my dignity intact. I'll survive this too. There was something in her tone, a hint of past pain that made him wonder what those worse situations had been. But before he could ask, not that he would have, Sophie's voice rang out from upstairs. Papa, Papa, I need you. He was up and moving before the second call, taking the stairs two at a time. Sophie's door was still closed, but he could hear her crying inside. Sophie, sweetheart, what's wrong? I had a bad dream. About Mama. His heart clenched. The nightmares had been frequent in the months after Margaret's death, but they'd been getting better. Until today. Can I come in? Only you, not her. He entered to find Sophie huddled in her bed, her favorite doll, one Margaret had made for her, clutched to her chest. Her face was red and blotchy from crying. Tell me about the dream, he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. Mama was trying to come home, but she couldn't find the house because everything was different, because she was here. The venom in that last word was painful to hear from such a young child. Sophie, your mama isn't coming back. We've talked about this. But why did you have to bring someone else? Why couldn't it just be us? How could he explain to a 6-year-old about mortgages and debts, about the crushing weight of trying to hold everything together alone? How could he tell her that some nights he stood in the barn and screamed into the darkness because the grief was eating him alive? That he'd married Clara not just to save the ranch, but because Morrison was right. He was failing Sophie, failing to be both mother and father, failing to keep his promise to Margaret to take care of their little girl. Sometimes adults have to make hard choices, he said finally. This was one of them. I hate her, Sophie whispered. You don't even know her. I don't want to know her. Ethan sighed, pulling Sophie into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face in his shirt. I'm not asking you to love her, Sophie. I'm just asking you to be polite. Can you do that? For me? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Will you make her go away if I'm good? Sophie, will you? We'll see, he said, hating himself for the half-truth. Now, try to get some sleep. He stayed until her breathing evened out, then carefully extracted himself and headed back downstairs. Clara was no longer in the dining room, but he found her in the kitchen, helping Molly with the dishes despite the older woman's protests. I'm perfectly capable, Mrs. O'Brien. I've been taking care of myself for years. It's not proper, Molly insisted. You're the lady of the house now. I'm a woman who knows how to wash dishes, Clara corrected gently, and I'd rather be useful than ornamental. She looked up as Ethan entered, her hands still in the soapy water. Is Sophie all right? Nightmare, he said shortly. About her mother? He nodded. That's natural. Change is frightening for children. She's processing grief and fear of abandonment simultaneously. She's 6, Ethan said defensively. She doesn't need to be analyzed. Clara dried her hands on a towel, her movements careful and deliberate. Understanding emotions doesn't diminish them, Mr. Walker. But if you'd prefer I not offer insights about your daughter, I'll refrain. There it was again, that calm, measured response to his rudeness. It was almost worse than if she'd gotten angry. Anger he could fight against. This quiet dignity left him feeling like a brute. I'm going to check on the horses, he said abruptly. Of course. Good evening, Mr. Walker. He escaped to the barn, where the familiar smells of hay and horse and leather welcomed him. Zeus nickered softly as he approached, and Ethan leaned against the stallion's stall, letting the animal's simple presence calm him. This was where he'd proposed to Margaret, right here in this barn. She'd been helping him with the difficult foaling, her hair coming loose from its pins, her dress stained with blood and birth fluids, and she'd never looked more beautiful to him. When the foal had finally stood on shaky legs, he'd dropped to one knee right there in the straw and asked her to be his wife. She'd laughed and cried at the same time, saying yes before he'd even finished the question. Now he was married to a woman whose last name he'd barely known this morning, whose favorite color he couldn't guess, whose dreams and fears were complete mysteries to him. The barn door creaked open, and he tensed, expecting Clara. But it was Molly, carrying a lantern and wearing her shawl against the evening chill. You planning to sleep out here? She asked. Considering it, Molly hung the lantern on a hook and leaned against the opposite stall. She's not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone weaker, I suppose. More desperate. But that one's got steel in her spine. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's an observation. Molly studied him with eyes that had seen too much life to be fooled by his gruff exterior. Margaret wouldn't want this for you, you know. This anger, this bitterness. Margaret would understand about saving the ranch she loved. The ranch, maybe. But treating that woman like she's the enemy? Margaret would have your hide for that. She was right, and he knew it. Margaret had never had an unkind word for anyone, always seeing the best in people even when they didn't deserve it. She would have welcomed Clara, probably would have had them being friends within an hour. It's too hard, Molly, he admitted, his voice breaking. Looking at her sitting in Margaret's chair, knowing she'll be sleeping under Margaret's roof, taking care of Margaret's daughter. None of that belongs to Margaret anymore, boy, Molly said gently. It belongs to the living, and that includes you and that little girl who needs a mother, whether she knows it or not. Sophie will never accept her. Sophie's 6. 6-year-olds say they'll never eat vegetables either, but somehow they grow up just fine. Molly pulled her shawl tighter. Give it time. Both of you need to give it time. She left him alone with his thoughts and the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. Eventually, he had to go back inside. The house was quiet, a single lamp burning in the hallway. Clara's door at the end of the hall was closed, no light showing beneath it. He paused outside the master bedroom. His bedroom now, his alone. The room still smelled faintly of Margaret's lavender soap, though it had been months since she'd used it. Her clothes still hung in the wardrobe. He hadn't been able to bring himself to pack them away. Her brush still sat on the dresser, a few golden hairs still caught in its bristles. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he'd have Molly pack everything away. It wasn't fair to Clara living in a shrine to another woman. It wasn't fair to Sophie, who needed to accept that her mother wasn't coming back. And it wasn't fair to him, torturing himself with ghosts. But tonight, he lay in the bed he'd shared with his wife, staring at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. 6 months ago, he'd had everything: a loving wife, a thriving ranch, a happy daughter. Now he had debts, a child who cried herself to sleep, and a stranger living down the hall who wore his ring but would never have his heart. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated Margaret's sampler on the wall, the one she'd stitched during her pregnancy with Sophie. Home is where love lives. The words seemed to mock him now. What happened to a home when love died? What became of it when duty and desperation moved in where love used to be? Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Clara, moving around, perhaps unable to sleep in her new surroundings. He wondered what she was thinking, if she was crying into her pillow or staring dry-eyed at the ceiling like him. Did she have someone she'd left behind, a love that circumstances had torn away from her? Or had she always been alone, always on the outside looking in at other people's happiness? He realized with a start that he knew almost nothing about her. 3 years she'd been in Silver Creek, and all he knew was that she came from Boston, taught school, and read books. Who were her parents? Why had she left Boston? What had driven her west to a small Colorado town where she knew no one? The questions nagged at him, but he pushed them away. It didn't matter. They were married now, bound by law and necessity, but that didn't mean he had to know her. They could live as polite strangers, sharing a house, but not a life. It would be easier that way, safer, because if he let himself know her, if he let her become real to him, then he might start to feel something. And feeling anything beyond the grief that had become his constant companion seemed like the ultimate betrayal of Margaret's memory. The clock in the hallway chimed midnight, marking the end of his wedding day. Ethan Walker closed his eyes and tried not to think about how many more empty days stretched ahead of him, tried not to wonder if Clara was lying awake counting them too, tried not to imagine what might have been if circumstances had been different for them both. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its lonely cry echoing across the valley. It sounded exactly like how he felt, wild, mournful, and utterly alone. The first week passed in a careful dance of avoidance. Clara rose before dawn, preparing breakfast with Molly's grudging assistance, and Ethan made sure to be in the barn by the time she entered the kitchen. They took their meals at opposite ends of the long table, Sophie's empty chair between them like an accusation. The child had taken to eating in her room, and neither adult had the energy to fight her on it. Clara spent her mornings attempting to learn the household routines, though Molly guarded her territory with fierce determination. "I've been doing this for 6 years, ma'am," she'd say whenever Clara offered to help with laundry or cooking. "I know what Mr. Walker likes." What Mr. Walker liked, Clara was learning, was to pretend she didn't exist. He spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, usually in clipped sentences that conveyed information and nothing more. "Storm coming tonight. Fence broke in the north pasture. Sophie needs new shoes before school starts. School." That was another source of tension. Clara had assumed she would continue teaching when the term began in 2 weeks, but Morrison had made it clear that married women didn't work outside the home in Silver Creek. "Your place is with your family now, Mrs. Walker," he'd said with that oily smile when she'd gone to town for supplies. "I'm sure your husband wouldn't want his wife working when there's so much to do at home." She'd wanted to tell him that her husband wouldn't notice if she sprouted wings and flew to the moon, but she'd held her tongue. Years of being the unwanted spinster had taught her the value of silence, of keeping her thoughts locked away where they couldn't be used against her. Now, on the 7th morning of her marriage, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Ethan work with a young horse in the corral. The morning sun caught the sweat on his skin, making him glow like something out of a Renaissance painting. He moved with an easy grace, his voice low and soothing as he coaxed the nervous animal to accept the saddle. There was a gentleness in him that he showed to every creature on this ranch, except her. "He's good with horses," Molly said, coming to stand beside her. "Has a gift for it. Margaret used to say he could whisper the wildness right out of them." Margaret, always Margaret. The ghost that haunted every room, every conversation. Clara had found evidence of her predecessor everywhere. A forgotten hairpin under the bureau, recipes written in a flowing hand tucked into the cookbook, a half-finished letter to a cousin in Texas, still sitting in the desk drawer. The whole house was a monument to a dead woman's memory. "She was beautiful, wasn't she?" Clara said, not really asking. She'd seen the photograph on the mantel, the delicate features and laughing eyes captured forever in sepia tones. "Inside and out," Molly confirmed. "Never knew her to say an unkind word about anyone. She had a way of making everyone feel special, like they were the most important person in the world when she talked to them. Everything Clara wasn't. She was too tall, too sharp-tongued, too educated, too Eastern. She'd never had that easy way with people that seemed to come naturally to women like Margaret. She'd always been the one standing at the edge of gatherings, book in hand, watching others dance and laugh and fall in love. "You're not trying to be her, are you?" Molly asked, and there was something almost kind in her voice. "How could I? I don't even know who I'm supposed to be here. Not a wife, certainly. Not a mother. I'm a placeholder, Mrs. O'Brien. A warm body to satisfy the bank and the town gossips. Molly was quiet for a moment, then said, You know, when Margaret first came here, she didn't know how to do anything. Couldn't cook, couldn't sew, couldn't tell a chicken from a rooster. She'd grown up in town. Her father was a shopkeeper. First time she tried to milk a cow, she got kicked so hard she had a bruise for 3 weeks. Clara turned to look at the older woman, surprised. The perfect Margaret had been imperfect once? My point is, Molly continued, everyone has to start somewhere. Even saints were sinners once. Before Clara could respond, Sophie burst through the back door, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Papa's horse threw him. He's hurt. Clara's heart stopped. She was running before she consciously decided to move, following Sophie's frantic figure toward the corral. She could see a crowd gathering, the ranch hands who'd been working nearby, all clustered around something on the ground. Ethan was sitting up when she reached him, blood streaming from a gash above his left eye. His shirt was torn, and she could see scrapes along his ribs where he'd hit the ground. I'm fine, he was saying to Tom, his foreman. Just got careless. You're bleeding, Clara said, dropping to her knees beside him without thinking. She pulled her handkerchief from her pocket, pressing it against the cut. And you might have a concussion. Can you see straight? How many fingers am I holding up? I said I'm fine, he growled, trying to pull away, but she caught his chin with her free hand, forcing him to look at her. How many fingers? Their eyes met, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. This close, she could see flecks of blue in his gray eyes, could smell the leather and sweat and something uniquely him. His pupils were equal, responsive. No concussion then. 3, he said quietly. Good. Can you stand? He nodded, and Tom helped him to his feet. He swayed slightly, and without thinking, Clara slipped under his arm, taking some of his weight. He stiffened, but didn't pull away. Sophie, run ahead and have Molly heat water, Clara instructed. Tom, can you manage the horse? The foreman nodded, already moving toward the agitated animal. Clara half-supported, half-guided Ethan toward the house, acutely aware of his body pressed against hers, the heat of him seeping through her dress. I can walk, he muttered. Humor me, she replied. I'd rather not have to explain to the town how I became a widow after only a week of marriage. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. In the kitchen, Molly had already prepared hot water and clean cloths. Clara guided Ethan to a chair, then began cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. You've done this before, he observed, wincing as she dabbed at the cut. My father was a doctor, she said, concentrating on her work. I assisted him from the time I was 12 until... She stopped abruptly. Until? Until I came west. She reached for the iodine. This will sting. It did. He hissed through his teeth but held still. Sophie watched from the doorway, her face pale with worry. Is Papa going to die? She whispered. No, sweetheart, Clara said gently. He's going to be just fine. Head wounds always bleed a lot, but this one isn't deep. He won't even need stitches. Sophie crept closer, drawn by the calm authority in Clara's voice. You know about medicine? A little. My father taught me. Could you teach me? It was the first time Sophie had spoken to her directly without anger or hostility. Clara was careful not to show how much it meant. If you'd like, she said casually. Though I should warn you, it involves learning about blood and bones and other things that might seem scary. I'm not scared, Sophie said quickly, lifting her chin in a gesture that was pure Ethan. I helped when our mare foaled last spring. There was lots of blood then. Brave girl, Clara murmured, applying a bandage to Ethan's forehead. There, all done. You'll have a headache, and you should rest today. I have work to do, which Tom and the other hands can manage for one day. She began packing away the medical supplies. Or would you prefer to pass out in the field and really give Sophie something to worry about? Their eyes met again, a silent battle of wills. Sophie watched them both, her gaze darting between them like she was watching a tennis match. Finally, Ethan relented. Fine. Half a day. The whole day? Until after lunch? Until tomorrow morning? You're awfully bossy for someone who's been here a week. And you're awfully stubborn for someone who just got thrown from a horse. Sophie giggled, actually giggled, and both adults turned to stare at her. She immediately covered her mouth, looking guilty for finding anything amusing in Clara's presence. "Why don't you sit with your father for a while?" Clara suggested. "Make sure he doesn't try to sneak out to the barn when I'm not looking." Sophie nodded solemnly, taking her duties seriously. She pulled a chair close to Ethan's, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm, as if reassuring herself he was really okay. Clara busied herself at the stove, giving them space but listening to their quiet conversation. Sophie was telling him about a bird's nest she'd found, her voice animated in a way Clara hadn't heard before. Ethan responded with genuine interest, asking questions, making suggestions about what kind of bird it might be. This was who they were without the weight of grief and resentment, a father and daughter who adored each other, who found joy in simple discoveries. Clara felt like an intruder witnessing something private and precious. "Miss Clara?" Sophie's voice startled her. "Could you teach me now? About medicine?" Clara glanced at Ethan, who shrugged slightly. Not exactly permission, but not refusal either. "We could start with something simple," Clara said carefully. "Would you like to learn how to make a healing salve? It's good for cuts and scrapes." Sophie nodded eagerly, and for the next hour, Clara taught her how to mix herbs and beeswax, how to test the consistency, how to store it properly. The child was a quick learner, asking intelligent questions, showing a focus that reminded Clara of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge in any form. "My mama used to make something that smelled like roses," Sophie said suddenly, her hands stilling in their work. "For her hands," she said. "Rose hip oil, probably," Clara said gently. "Would you like to learn to make that too?" Sophie bit her lip, clearly torn between loyalty to her mother's memory and curiosity. Finally, curiosity won. "Maybe. If it's not the same. If it's different from Mama's." "Everything we make will be different," Clara assured her. "This is our recipe, yours and mine, not anyone else's." Sophie seemed satisfied with that, returning to her work with renewed concentration. Ethan watched them from his chair, his expression unreadable. Clara couldn't tell if he was angry about Sophie warming to her or relieved that his daughter was showing interest in something besides grief. The peace was shattered by the sound of horses approaching fast. Tom burst through the door, his face grim. "Boss, we got trouble. Morrison's here with some men, saying something about inspecting the property." Ethan was on his feet immediately, swaying only slightly. "What kind of inspection?" "The kind where they're looking for reasons to call in your loan early," Tom said bluntly. He's got that smile on his face, the one that means someone's about to lose everything. Clara felt her stomach drop. She'd seen that smile, knew exactly what it meant. Morrison was a predator who fed on others' misfortunes, and he'd clearly decided that forcing this marriage wasn't enough. "I'll talk to him," Ethan said, heading for the door. "Wait," Clara said. "Let me come with you." "This isn't your problem." "I'm your wife. Legally, that makes it very much my problem." She untied her apron, smoothing her hair. "Besides, Morrison might be less aggressive with a lady present." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but Tom nodded. "She's got a point, boss. Morrison likes to keep up appearances." They walked out together, not touching but presenting a united front. Morrison sat on his horse like a king surveying his domain, flanked by two men Clara recognized as his enforcers, men who'd thrown more than one family off their land. "Ethan," Morrison said, tipping his hat mockingly. "Mrs. Walker, how lovely you look. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Mr. Morrison," Clara said coolly, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" "Just a routine inspection. Need to make sure my investment is being properly maintained." His piggy eyes swept over the property, cataloging every loose board, every patch of peeling paint. "I see the barn needs repairs, and that fence line is looking shabby." "Nothing that affects the value of the property," Ethan said tightly. "Oh, but it does. You see, I've had an offer on this land. A very generous offer from someone who could put it to better use. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. And when you default on your loan, which, let's be honest, we both know you will, I'll be happy to facilitate the transfer." Clara stepped forward. "May I see the loan documents, Mr. Morrison?" He blinked, clearly not expecting that. "I beg your pardon?" "The loan documents, the original agreement my husband signed. I'd like to review them." "Whatever for, it's hardly a woman's concern." On the contrary, as Ethan's wife, his debts are now mine. I have every right to understand our financial obligations." She held out her hand expectantly. Morrison's face reddened. "I don't carry such documents with me." "How convenient. Then I suppose this inspection will have to wait until you can produce them. After all, we wouldn't want any misunderstandings about the terms of the agreement. The terms are simple. He owes me money. If he can't pay, he loses the ranch. The specific terms, Mr. Morrison. Payment schedules, interest rates, penalties. All the details that I'm sure a businessman of your reputation would have carefully documented." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "You're quite the little lawyer, aren't you? I'm a woman who reads contracts before signing them, a habit I learned from my father." "Your father the doctor?" "My father the doctor who also happened to have a law degree from Harvard." It was true, though her father had never practiced law, preferring medicine. But Morrison didn't need to know that detail. The banker's face went from red to purple. "You can't." "I can, and I will request a full accounting of this loan, Mr. Morrison. And if I find any irregularities, any hint of usury or fraudulent terms, I will take it to the territorial judge. Judge Hammond, I believe? He struck me as a man of integrity when I met him at church last Sunday." It was a bluff, mostly. She had met the judge briefly, but she had no idea if he would take their side against Morrison. But the banker didn't know that. Morrison yanked his horse's reins hard enough to make the animal dance nervously. "You've got 6 months, Walker. 6 months to pay in full, or this ranch is mine." He glared at Clara. "And you might want to teach your wife her proper place before she finds herself in trouble she can't talk her way out of." He rode off with his men, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Ethan turned to Clara, his expression unreadable. "Harvard?" he said finally. "I didn't lie. My father did have a degree from Harvard. And you just happened to forget to mention that? You never asked." She met his gaze steadily. "You've made it clear you don't want to know anything about me, remember?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "That was impressive. What you did there. It was a delay tactic, nothing more. He'll be back and he'll be angrier. Still, you didn't have to do that. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." She gestured to the ranch around them. "This is my home now, whether either of us likes it or not. If Morrison takes this ranch, I lose too. Sophie loses. We all lose. So it's about self-preservation." "Partly." She hesitated, then added, "And partly because men like Morrison have been making women like me dance to their tune my whole life. I'm tired of it." Something shifted in his expression, a recognition of shared experience. They'd both been forced into this marriage by Morrison's machinations, both been stripped of their choices. "We need to look at those documents," Clara said. "The real ones. There might be something we can use." "They're in the study," Ethan said slowly. I haven't been in there since Margaret died. It was her favorite room. Would you like me to get them?" He shook his head. "No, it's time. I need to stop avoiding it." They walked back to the house together, and Clara was surprised when Sophie slipped her hand into hers as they entered. The gesture was tentative, ready to be withdrawn at the first sign of rejection. Clara kept her grip gentle, neither holding too tight nor letting go. The study door had been closed for so long the hinges creaked in protest. The room beyond was frozen in time, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Books lined 2 walls, their spines showing an eclectic mix of interests: poetry, agriculture, history, novels. A delicate writing desk sat near the window, papers still scattered across its surface, as if Margaret had just stepped out for a moment. Ethan stood in the doorway like he was facing a firing squad. Clara could see the pain etched in every line of his body. "She loved this room," he said quietly. "Spent hours here reading, writing letters. She was teaching herself Latin from those books over there. Said she wanted Sophie to have a proper education, not just the basics they teach at the town school." "She sounds like she was remarkable," Clara said honestly. "She was." He moved into the room slowly, running his fingers along the desk's surface. "She would have liked you, I think. You're both fighters in your own ways." It was the kindest thing he'd said to her since their wedding. Clara didn't know how to respond, so she stayed silent. Ethan opened a drawer in the desk, pulling out a leather portfolio. "The loan documents are in here. Margaret kept all the important papers organized. She had a better head for numbers than I did. They spread the papers on the desk, Clara pulling up a chair while Ethan stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Sophie had wandered over to the bookshelves, running her small fingers along the spines with reverent care. "Here," Clara said, pointing to a clause in the contract. "This interest rate is higher than what he told you originally, isn't it?" "Yes." "He said it was 8%, but this says 12. And here, this penalty clause. It says if you miss even one payment, he can call in the entire loan immediately. That's not standard." "I didn't read it carefully," Ethan admitted. "Margaret was sick, dying, and I just needed money for the doctor, for medicine. I would have signed anything." Clara heard the guilt in his voice, the self-recrimination. "He took advantage of your desperation. That's what men like Morrison do." She continued reading, her finger tracking along the lines of text. There was something here, something not quite right about the language, the terms. Her father had taught her to read contracts, had shown her how unscrupulous men hid their tricks in legal language. "Wait," she said suddenly. "This date, when did you sign this?" "March 15th. "But this is dated March 20th. And look, the interest rate calculation starts from March 1st, not the date of signing." Ethan leaned closer, his breath stirring her hair. "He's been charging me interest for weeks before I even got the money?" "Not just that. If the date is wrong, the whole contract might be void, or at least questionable enough to take to a judge." She turned to look at him, not realizing how close he was. Their faces were inches apart, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, could count his eyelashes. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them seemed to crackle with sudden awareness. Clara's heart thundered in her chest, and she saw Ethan's eyes drop to her lips for just an instant before he pulled back, clearing his throat. "We should take this to a lawyer," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Do you know one you trust?" "There's a man in Denver, Samuel Fletcher. He helped my neighbor with a land dispute last year. Denver's a day's ride each way." "I'll leave tomorrow." "We'll leave tomorrow," Clara corrected. "This affects both of us. Besides, I might be able to help explain the contract issues we've found." He looked like he wanted to argue, but then nodded. "What about Sophie?" "I can stay with Molly," Sophie piped up from where she'd been listening. "I'll be good, I promise." It was the first time she'd volunteered to make things easier for Clara. Another small victory. That evening, dinner was different. They still sat at opposite ends of the table, but Sophie joined them, chattering about what she'd learned making the salve. Ethan actually responded to Clara's questions about the ranch, explaining their water rights, the grazing rotation, the plans he'd had for expansion before everything fell apart. "You could still do it," Clara said. "If we can get Morrison off our backs, those plans could work." "We?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Like it or not, we're partners now. Your success is mine. Your failure is mine." "That's a heavy burden to put on you." "I've carried heavier," she said quietly, and again he gave her that look like he was trying to solve a puzzle. After Sophie went to bed, only one request for Ethan instead of 3, progress, Clara found herself alone with him on the porch. The evening was cool, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. She'd brought out coffee, and they sat in the 2 rocking chairs, not talking, but not exactly uncomfortable either. "Why did you really come west?" Ethan asked suddenly. Clara was quiet for a long moment, debating how much to reveal. "My father died," she finally said. "Suddenly. A heart attack. We discovered afterward that he'd been hiding debts, gambling debts. Everything had to be sold. The house, his practice, everything. I had enough money to get away, to start over somewhere where no one knew about the scandal." "And you picked Silver Creek?" "I picked the farthest place from Boston I could afford to reach." She took a sip of coffee. "I thought I could disappear here, be anonymous. Instead, I became the town spinster, the subject of more gossip than I'd ever been back home." "I'm sorry," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "Don't be. I made my choices, just like you made yours. I didn't choose to lose my wife." "No, but you chose to marry me. You could have let Morrison take the ranch, started over somewhere else. This land is all Sophie has left of her mother. I couldn't take that from her too." They lapsed into silence again, but it was more comfortable now, less weighted with resentment. Clara found herself stealing glances at him in the dim light. He was handsome, in a rough-hewn way, with strong features and capable hands. Under different circumstances, she might have... No, she couldn't think like that. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. The fact that her heart had raced when he'd been close to her in the study meant nothing. She was simply lonely, responding to the first bit of kindness he'd shown her. "Thank you," Ethan said suddenly, "for what you did with Morrison, for helping Sophie today, for not giving up even though I've been..." He trailed off. Difficult, stubborn, occasionally insufferable? A smile ghosted across his lips. "I was going to say unwelcoming. That too. I know this isn't what you wanted, Clara, this life, this marriage, but I want you to know. I'll try to make it bearable. I can't offer you love or affection, but I can offer you respect, partnership." It was more than she'd expected, though less than that treacherous part of her heart wanted. "Partnership," she agreed. "That's enough." But as she lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the old house settle around her, she wondered if it would be enough. She could already feel the walls around her heart beginning to crack, letting in dangerous feelings for a man who would never love her. She thought of the way he'd looked at her in the study, that moment of connection, and ruthlessly pushed the memory away. This was a business arrangement. She needed to remember that. Her heart had no place in this marriage, no matter how much it might want to claim otherwise. She'd survived heartbreak before, though that seemed pale and childish now compared to the complex pain of living with someone who tolerating her presence for necessity's sake. Down the hall, she heard Ethan's footsteps pacing his room. Was he thinking of Margaret, missing her warmth beside him? Or was he perhaps thinking of that moment in the study too, that unexpected spark of something? She turned over, burying her face in the pillow. Tomorrow they would go to Denver, try to save the ranch. Tomorrow they would continue this dance of polite partnership. Tomorrow she would be stronger, would rebuild the walls around her heart. But tonight, in the darkness of her small room, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if things were different. If she'd met Ethan before Margaret. If they'd chosen each other instead of being forced together. If Sophie could learn to love her not as a replacement, but as herself. If the word wife could mean something more than a legal designation. Dangerous thoughts, foolish thoughts. But in the darkness, with no one to see or judge, she held them close like precious secrets, these dreams of what could never be. The journey to Denver began before dawn, the sky still holding on to night's last stars. Claire had packed carefully, her traveling dress a practical dark blue wool that wouldn't show the dust of the road. She'd braided her hair tightly, pinning it in a coronet that would withstand the wind. When she emerged from her room, she found Ethan already waiting by the wagon, checking the horses' harnesses one final time. "You could have woken me earlier to help," she said, climbing up onto the seat without waiting for his assistance. "Didn't want to disturb you." He swung up beside her, taking the reins. "It's a long journey." "I've traveled longer." She adjusted her shawl against the morning chill. "From Boston to here took 2 weeks. By train and stage, I imagine. Not by farm wagon over rough roads." "Are you trying to convince me to stay behind, Mr. Walker? Would it work if I were?" "Not in the slightest." He made that sound again, the one that might have been a laugh if he'd let it fully form. Clara was beginning to recognize it as his way of acknowledging points scored against him. They rode in companionable silence as the sun rose, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Clara found herself mesmerized by the landscape, so different from the crowded streets and gray harbors of Boston. Here, the world seemed endless, full of possibilities and second chances. "It's beautiful," she murmured, not really meaning to speak aloud. "Different from back east?" "Like another world entirely. In Boston, you can't see the horizon, buildings and people everywhere pressing in. Here." She gestured at the vast expanse of prairie and mountain. "Here, you can breathe." Margaret said something similar when she first came out. His voice was thoughtful rather than pained. Said the space made her feel small but free at the same time. That's exactly it. Clara glanced at him. Where was she from originally? St. Louis. Her father ran a dry goods store there, but he had dreams of cattle ranching. Brought the whole family out when Margaret was 16. She used to joke that he dragged them to the edge of the world. But she loved it? Eventually. Took some adjusting. The first winter nearly broke her. She'd never seen snow like we get here. But by spring, she said she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. It was the most he'd spoken about Margaret, without that edge of grief making his voice sharp. Clara treasured the small confidence, filing it away with the other pieces of information she'd been gathering about this complex man beside her. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses and eat the lunch Molly had packed. Clara spread a blanket under a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek, the sound of water a pleasant accompaniment to their meal. Ethan seemed more relaxed away from the ranch, as if the distance from memories allowed him to breathe easier. "Tell me about this lawyer," Clara said, cutting slices from a loaf of bread. "Can we trust him?" "Sam Fletcher's honest as they come. We served together briefly during the war." "You were in the war?" She hadn't known this about him. 3 years, cavalry. He accepted the bread and cheese she offered. "Longest 3 years of my life. Sam saved my life at Chancellorsville. Figure that makes him trustworthy enough." "How did he save your life?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I took a bullet in the shoulder, fell from my horse in the middle of a charge. Sam rode back for me, pulled me up onto his mount while under fire. Foolish thing to do. Could have gotten us both killed. But that was Sam, always doing the right thing even when it was the stupid thing." "Sounds like someone else I know," Clara said quietly. "Marrying a stranger to save his ranch and protect his daughter isn't exactly the easy choice." "That's different. That's necessity." "Is it? You could have taken Sophie and started over somewhere else. Plenty of men would have. And plenty of women would have said no to Morrison's scheme." "True." She pulled her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "But I was so tired of fighting alone. At least this way, I'm fighting alongside someone, even if we're not fighting for each other." The honesty in her voice made something shift in his chest. "Clara, we should keep moving," she said quickly, already standing and shaking out the blanket. "We want to reach Denver before dark." He let her retreat, recognizing the defensive maneuver. He did the same thing when conversations veered too close to feelings he wasn't ready to examine. Denver sprawled before them as the sun began its descent, a city of ambition built on gold rush dreams and railway promises. The streets teemed with people, miners and merchants, painted ladies and proper wives, children darting between wagons and dogs barking at everything. "It's so loud," Clara said, and he heard the slight distress in her voice. "After the ranch, it's overwhelming," he agreed. "Sam's office is just 2 streets over. We can settle in the hotel first if you'd prefer." "No, let's see him while we can. I want to know where we stand." The law office of Fletcher and Associates occupied the 2nd floor of a solid brick building. Sam himself answered their knock, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he saw Ethan. "Walker, good to see you, man." Then noticing Clara, "And this must be the new Mrs. Walker. I heard you'd remarried." "News travels even to Denver, apparently," Ethan said dryly. "Sam, this is Clara. Clara, Sam Fletcher." Sam was everything Ethan wasn't: polished, educated, comfortable in his city clothes and manners. He took Clara's hand with practiced gallantry, and Ethan felt an unexpected stab of something that couldn't possibly be jealousy. "A pleasure, Mrs. Walker. Please, come in. What brings you to Denver, Lee?" Ethan said dryly. "Sam, this is Clara. Clara, Sam Fletcher." Sam was everything Ethan wasn't: polished, educated, comfortable in his city clothes and manners. He took Clara's hand with practiced gallantry, and Ethan felt an unexpected stab of something that couldn't possibly be jealousy. "A pleasure, Mrs. Walker. Please, come in. What brings you to Denver?" They settled in Sam's office, Clara producing the loan documents from her satchel. She explained their findings with clear precision, pointing out the discrepancies and questionable terms. Sam listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. "This is definitely irregular," he said finally. "Morrison's been playing these games for years, but this might be the first time he's been careless enough to leave evidence. The date discrepancy alone could be grounds for challenging the entire agreement." "So we have a case?" Ethan asked. "You have the beginning of one," I'll need to do some research, check territorial law regarding usurious lending practices. But Claire's right. This contract has serious problems. How long before we'd have an answer? Claire asked. Give me tonight to review everything thoroughly. Can you stay until tomorrow afternoon? Ethan glanced at Clara, who nodded. We'll be at the Imperial Hotel. Sam stood, shaking their hands again. This is good work, Clara. Have you studied law? Only what my father taught me. He believed women should understand contracts and legal matters, even if we can't practice law ourselves. A forward-thinking man. We could use more like him. Sam's smile was warm, appreciative, and Ethan found himself stepping slightly closer to Clara. We should go, he said abruptly. Find our rooms before full dark. Outside, Clara seemed energized by the meeting. He seems competent, and he clearly respects you. Sam's a good man, one of the few I trust completely. You don't trust easily, do you? Not anymore. The words came out harder than intended. The Imperial Hotel was modest but clean, and Ethan requested 2 rooms as expected. But the clerk shook his head apologetically. I'm sorry, sir, but we only have 1 room available. There's a cattlemen's convention in town, and we're nearly full. Clara's face remained carefully neutral, but Ethan saw her hands tighten on her reticule. We'll find another hotel, Ethan said. I'm afraid you'll find the same situation everywhere, sir. The whole city's booked. You're lucky we have even 1 room. They looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Clara spoke. We'll take it. The room was small but pleasant, with a single bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window. They stood awkwardly in the doorway, neither wanting to be the first to enter. I'll sleep in the chair, Ethan said. Don't be ridiculous. You're too tall. You'll be in agony by morning. I'll take the chair. Clara, or we could be adults about this, she said, her cheeks pink but her chin lifted in that defiant way he was beginning to recognize. The bed is large enough. We can share it without anything improper happening. The thought of lying beside her, even fully clothed, even with careful distance between them, made his pulse race in a way it hadn't since Margaret, which was exactly why he shouldn't agree to it. All right, he heard himself say. They took turns preparing for bed, Clara disappearing down the hall to the women's washroom while Ethan changed into the clean shirt and trousers he'd brought. When she returned, she was wearing a high-neck nightgown covered by a wool wrapper, her hair loose in a braid down her back. She looked younger, softer, and he had to turn away from the sight. They lay down with careful precision, each claiming their edge of the mattress with a good foot of space between them. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sounds from the street below and their carefully regulated breathing. Ethan? Clara's voice was barely a whisper in the darkness. Yes? What if this doesn't work? The legal challenge, I mean. What if Morrison still takes the ranch? He stared at the ceiling, considering. Then we start over. Find somewhere else. Build something new. We're married, aren't we? For better or worse. She was quiet for so long he thought she'd fallen asleep. Then, so softly he almost missed it. I never expected you to honor that part. I may not be a good husband, Clara, but I keep my vows. All of them. He felt the mattress shift as she turned to look at him, though he kept his eyes fixed upward. You're not as bad a husband as you think. I've barely been a husband at all. You've been grieving. That's understandable. For how long? How long before it becomes an excuse rather than a reason? There's no timeline for grief, Ethan. It takes what it takes. Margaret would have wanted me to move on, to be happy. But you're not ready. No, he admitted. But I'm trying. You deserve that much, at least. Me trying. Now she was definitely looking at him. He could feel the weight of her gaze. That's more than I expected when I stood at that altar. Unable to resist, he turned his head to meet her eyes. In the moonlight filtering through the window, her face was all planes and shadows, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength and intelligence and unexpected kindness. What did you expect? He asked. Tolerance, resentment, maybe eventual indifference if I was lucky. And instead, I got a man who's honorable even in his pain, who loves his daughter more than his own happiness, who's trying to be fair even when life has been anything but fair to him. The words hung between them, too honest, too revealing. Ethan felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. "Clara, A crash from the room next door broke the moment, followed by drunken laughter and singing. The spell shattered, and they both turned away, returning to their careful positions on opposite sides of the bed. But something had changed in that moment of connection. The space between them no longer felt like a gulf, but like a bridge waiting to be crossed. When Clara's breathing eventually deepened into sleep, Ethan found himself listening to the sound, finding an unexpected comfort in her presence. He thought of Margaret, wondering what she would make of this situation. She'd always been the romantic one, believing in fate and destiny and love conquering all. She would probably laugh at the irony of him lying beside a woman he was beginning to respect, maybe even like, while holding himself apart out of loyalty to her memory. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Ethan Walker," he could almost hear her say. "Stop punishing yourself and that poor woman for being alive." When he finally slept, he dreamed not of Margaret, but of green eyes flecked with gold and a voice saying "we," like it was a promise. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. They dressed with awkward efficiency, careful not to look at each other, both hyper-aware of the intimacy they'd shared. Breakfast in the hotel dining room was a silent affair, though not uncomfortably so. It was as if they were both processing something, turning it over in their minds like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit anywhere yet. Sam's news, when they returned to his office, was better than they'd hoped. "Morrison's in serious trouble if this goes before a judge," he said, spreading out additional documents he'd researched. "The territorial laws are clear about usury, and the interest rate he's charging exceeds legal limits. Combined with the date discrepancies and the unclear terms, you have grounds not just to challenge the loan, but potentially to have it declared void." "What does that mean exactly?" Claire asked, leaning forward. "It means Morrison might have to return any payments already made and cancel the debt entirely. At minimum, a judge would likely order a restructuring of the loan at legal interest rates, which would reduce your payments significantly." "He won't let this go to court," Ethan said grimly. "Morrison's got too much to lose if word gets out about his practices." Exactly. Sam smiled like a chess player who'd just cornered his opponent's king. "Which means he'll negotiate. I can draw up a letter outlining our findings and our intention to file suit. My guess is he'll offer to restructure rather than risk exposure." "Do it," Clara said before Ethan could respond. When both men looked at her, she flushed but didn't back down. "We need to act quickly, before he finds another way to corner us." Sam nodded approvingly. "I'll have it ready within the hour. You can take it back with you, deliver it personally. Sometimes the shock value of immediate action works in our favor." While Sam prepared the documents, Ethan and Clara walked through Denver's streets, stopping at shops for supplies they couldn't get in Silver Creek. Clara paused at a bookshop window, her eyes lighting up at the display. "Go ahead," Ethan said. "Look around." "We shouldn't spend unnecessarily." "Books aren't unnecessary. Margaret always said that." He opened the shop door. "Besides, Sophie's been asking about new stories." They spent an hour in the shop, Clara carefully selecting books for Sophie, fairy tales and beginning readers, while Ethan watched her animated discussions with the proprietor about different editions and authors. She was in her element here, surrounded by knowledge and stories, and he found himself charmed by her enthusiasm. "You miss it," he observed as they left with their wrapped purchases. "Teaching. Every day." She clutched the books like treasures. "I loved watching children discover they could read, that all these worlds were suddenly open to them. It was like giving them keys to kingdoms." "You could teach Sophie. Really teach her, I mean. Not just the basics she'll get at the town school." Clara stopped walking, looking up at him with surprise. "You'd want that?" Margaret would have wanted it. She believed in education, especially for girls, said they needed it even more than boys because the world would try to tell them they were less capable. "Your wife was a remarkable woman." "She was. But so are you, in different ways." The compliment hung between them, unexpected and sincere. Clara's cheeks pinked, and she looked away. "We should get back to Sam's office." The letter Sam had prepared was a masterpiece of legal threat wrapped in polite language. It laid out their evidence, cited relevant territorial statutes, and gave Morrison 30 days to respond with a restructuring proposal or face litigation. "This should do it," Sam said, handing over the sealed envelope. "But be careful, cornered rats bite." "Morrison's not a rat," Ethan said. "He's a snake." "Either way, watch your backs." The journey home was different from the ride out. They talked more freely, discussing strategies for the ranch, ideas for increasing revenue. Clara, it turned out, had been observing more than he'd realized during her weeks at the ranch. "You have that section of land by the creek that's too rocky for cattle," she said. "But it would be perfect for an orchard. Apples grow well at this altitude, and there's a growing market for them in the mining towns. That would take years to show profit." "Yes, but it's a long-term investment. Something for Sophie's future." Something for Sophie's future. The phrase implied permanence, a belief that they would all still be together years from now. Ethan found he didn't hate the idea as much as he would have even a week ago. As they neared the ranch, they saw smoke rising from the direction of the house. Too much smoke. Ethan whipped the horses into a run, his heart pounding with sudden fear. Fire was every rancher's nightmare, capable of destroying everything in minutes. But as they crested the final hill, they saw it wasn't the house burning, but a pile of something in the yard. Sophie was standing near it with Molly, both of them covered in soot, but clearly unharmed. "Papa!" Sophie ran to them as they pulled up. "Mr. Morrison's men came. They said they were taking inventory for when the ranch becomes his, but Tom and the hands ran them off." Ethan jumped down, pulling Sophie into his arms. "Are you hurt? Is anyone hurt?" "No, but they tried to take Mama's things from the study. Molly and I stopped them, and then Tom came, and there was shouting, and Mr. Morrison said you'd be sorry for crossing him." Clara had climbed down too, and to Ethan's surprise, Sophie reached for her with her free arm. Clara didn't hesitate, joining the embrace, the three of them standing together like the family they weren't quite yet. "What's burning?" Clara asked. "Some old furniture from the barn Mr. Morrison's men broke when Tom made them leave," Molly explained. "Figured it was better to burn it than let it clutter things up." But Ethan saw the truth in Tom's eyes when the foreman approached. Whatever Morrison's men had broken had been deliberate, a warning. "Everyone's all right, boss," Tom said quietly. "But they'll be back. Men like that don't give up easy." "No, they don't." Ethan pulled the letter from his coat. "But neither do we. Tom, I need you to ride to town tomorrow. This gets delivered directly to Morrison's hand. Make sure there are witnesses." Tom grinned, understanding. "With pleasure, boss." That night, dinner felt different. Sophie sat between Ethan and Clara instead of just next to her father, chattering about her adventures defending the house. She'd apparently wielded a fire poker while Molly threatened Morrison's men with her cast-iron skillet. "We were very brave," Sophie announced. "Weren't we, Miss Clara?" "You were," Clara agreed. "Though I wasn't here for the battle." "But you stood up to Mr. Morrison before, Papa told me. You used big words and made him turn red like a tomato." "Did he now?" Clara glanced at Ethan, who suddenly found his potatoes very interesting. "He said you were magnificent." Sophie sounded out the word carefully. "What does that mean?" "It means impressive," Clara explained, her cheeks pink. "Then you were magnificent, and today Molly and I were magnificent too." "Indeed you were," Ethan agreed, ruffling his daughter's hair. "My magnificent defenders." After Sophie went to bed, asking Clara to tuck her in alongside Ethan, another first, the adults sat on the porch in their customary chairs, but the space between them felt smaller somehow, charged with possibility. "Thank you," Ethan said, "for everything. The legal help, being kind to Sophie, not running when things got dangerous." "Where would I run to?" Clara asked, but her tone was gentle, almost teasing. "Anywhere safer than here. Safety's overrated." She pulled her shawl closer. "Besides, I meant what I said in Denver. We're in this together. Partners. Partners." She stood, pausing at the door. "Ethan, that night in Denver, when you said you keep all your vows, yes? I want you to know I do too. I may not have chosen this marriage, but I choose to honor it. Whatever comes." She went inside before he could respond, leaving him alone with the stars and the growing realization that somewhere between "I do" and Denver, He'd begun to see her not as an obligation, but as possibility. Not Margaret, never Margaret, but Clara. Complex, intelligent, brave Clara, who stood up to bullies and taught his daughter about medicine and looked beautiful in moonlight. The thought terrified him. It felt like betrayal, like forgetting, like moving on. But it also felt like spring after a long winter, like the first green shoots pushing through frozen ground. Life insisting on itself despite loss, despite grief, despite the thousand reasons it shouldn't. In the house, he heard Clara moving around her room, preparing for bed. Soon, she'd be lying in that narrow bed, perhaps thinking of their shared night in Denver, perhaps wondering like he was what it meant that the space between them was shrinking with each passing day. Morrison would retaliate. The fight for the ranch was far from over. There would be more challenges, more dangers. But for the first time since Margaret's death, Ethan didn't feel like he was facing them alone. He had Clara now, unexpected, unsought, but increasingly essential Clara. "We," she'd said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe, just maybe, it was starting to be. Morrison's response came 3 days later, delivered not by messenger but by the man himself, accompanied by Sheriff Bradley and 2 deputies. Ethan was mending fence in the north pasture when he saw the riders approaching, their dust cloud visible long before their faces. He whistled sharply, the signal that brought Tom and the other hands running. "Stay calm," he told his men. "No one draws unless they do." But it was Clara who met them at the house, standing on the porch with Sophie behind her, partially hidden by her skirts. She'd seen them coming from the window where she'd been teaching Sophie arithmetic, and something in their formation had warned her this wasn't a social call. "Mrs. Walker?" Morrison tipped his hat mockingly. "How charming you look today. Is your husband about?" "He's working, as honest men do," Clara replied evenly. "Perhaps I can help you?" "I doubt that very much." Morrison pulled a document from his coat. "This is a court summons. Seems there's been some question about damages to my property." "What damages?" Clara kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "My men report they were assaulted while conducting legal business on this ranch. One has a broken nose, another a cracked rib. I'm seeking compensation." "Your men were trespassing," Clara said, "and any injuries they sustained were the result of their own aggressive behavior." Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a decent man, Clara knew, but Morrison held his mortgage too. The whole town was caught in the banker's web one way or another. Ethan arrived then, Zeus lathered from the hard ride. He dismounted smoothly, positioning himself between Clara and Morrison. "What's this about?" Morrison repeated his claims, embellishing the story with each telling. According to him, his men had been peacefully documenting property when they were set upon by ranch hands wielding clubs and firearms. "That's a lie," Tom said, having just arrived. "They were trying to force their way into the house. Mrs. O'Brien hit one with a skillet when he grabbed Miss Sophie." "A violent household indeed," Morrison said smoothly. "I'm sure the judge will be interested to hear about the dangerous environment young Sophie is being raised in. Perhaps the child would be better off in more civilized care." The threat was clear. Clara felt Ethan tense beside her, saw his hand move toward his gun. She caught his wrist, squeezing gently. "Sheriff Bradley," she said, stepping forward. "You're a fair man. Will you take statements from all witnesses, not just Mr. Morrison's men?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable but nodded. "That would be proper, ma'am." "Then please, come inside. Mrs. O'Brien can tell you exactly what happened." The next hour was tense, with Molly providing her account while Morrison's face grew progressively redder. The housekeeper was unshakable in her testimony, and even Morrison's attempts to twist her words failed. "The man put his hands on Miss Sophie," Molly stated firmly, "tried to carry her off when she wouldn't tell him where her papa kept his papers. Any mother would have done what I did, and what Mrs. Walker would have done if she'd been here." "She's not the child's mother," Morrison snapped. "She is now," Sophie piped up, surprising everyone. "Papa married her, so she's my mother now. Maybe not my first mother, but my now mother." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Ethan's hand found hers, squeezing briefly in acknowledgement of the moment. Sheriff Bradley closed his notebook. "Seems to me this was a misunderstanding that got out of hand. No charges will be filed on either side." Morrison's face purpled. "This is outrageous. I demand—" You demand nothing on my ranch, Ethan said quietly, dangerously. You've had your investigation, Sheriff. Now I'll thank you all to leave. Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. You have 30 days, Walker. 30 days to pay in full, or I'll take this ranch piece by piece. And your little lawyer friend in Denver can't help you with that. After they left, Clara found herself shaking. Ethan guided her to a chair, pressing a glass of whiskey into her hands. Drink, he ordered gently. I don't usually eat. Today you do. The liquor burned, but it stopped the trembling. Sophie climbed into her lap, something she'd never done before, and Clara held her close. Did I do good? Sophie whispered. Calling you my now mother? You did perfect, sweetheart, Clara whispered back, kissing the top of her head. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan found Clara in the study going through ledgers by lamplight. She'd taken to working there in the evenings, and he no longer felt the sharp pain of seeing someone else in Margaret's space. What are you doing? Looking for money, she said bluntly. We need $3,000 in 30 days, or we need to find legal grounds to stop him. 3,000 might as well be 3 million. Not necessarily. She showed him her calculations. If we sold off some cattle now, even at reduced prices, that's 800. The horses you've been training could bring 500 if we found the right buyer. There's timber on the eastern section we could sell logging rights to. That would destroy the watershed. Not if we limit it, specify which trees. She rubbed her eyes tiredly. I've been corresponding with some contacts in Boston. There might be investors interested in Western ventures. You've been writing to Boston? He was surprised she hadn't mentioned it. My father's former partner. He's wealthy, always looking for investments. I thought maybe... She trailed off at his expression. You hate the idea. I hate being in debt to anyone else. Even to save the ranch? He was quiet for a long moment, then sat down across from her. Tell me about this partner. They worked until past midnight, exploring options, discarding most as impractical or too risky. Finally, Clara set down her pen. There is one other possibility, she said carefully. My aunt in Boston. She's wealthy, widowed, no children. She never approved of my coming west, said I was throwing my life away. But if I wrote to her, explained the situation, asked her to save your failure of a marriage, the bitterness in his voice stung. Is that what this is? A failure? Isn't it? You're trapped on a failing ranch with a man who can't... He stopped abruptly. Can't what? Can't be the husband you deserve, he finished quietly. Can't love you the way a husband should love his wife. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara stood slowly, moving around the desk to where he sat. She knelt beside his chair, looking up at him with those green-gold eyes that seemed to see right through him. Ethan, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. She took his hand in both of hers. I didn't come to this marriage expecting love. I came expecting survival. But what I've found, it's more than I hoped for. You're grieving, and that's all right. I'm not asking you to stop loving Margaret. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm just asking you to stop punishing yourself for being alive. He looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers intertwined with his sun-bronzed ones. Sometimes I forget she's gone, he admitted. I'll see something and think, wait until I tell Margaret, and then I remember. And then I feel guilty when I realize I've gone hours without thinking of her. That's not betrayal, that's healing. Is it? Because lately I've been... He stopped, unable to voice what he'd been feeling when he looked at Clara, when he heard her laugh with Sophie, when he lay awake thinking about their night in Denver. Been what? Noticing things. About you. The admission came out rough. The way you hum when you're cooking, how you bite your lip when you're concentrating, the way the sunlight catches in your hair when you're working in the garden. Clara's breath caught. Ethan, I don't know what to do with these feelings, Clara. They feel like betrayal, but they also feel like life, like waking up after a long sleep. She raised their joined hands to her lips, kissing his knuckles gently. There's no rush. We have time to figure this out. Do we? Morrison's giving us 30 days. Then we'll fight him, together.
That word again. Together. It was beginning to sound less like a business arrangement and more like a promise.
The next morning brought unexpected hope in the form of Sam Fletcher himself, riding up with a grin that said he had good news. "I've been digging into Morrison's past," he announced over coffee. "Turns out our friend has been playing this game in 3 other territories. There are warrants in Kansas and Missouri for fraud." "How does that help us?" Ethan asked. "Because if we can prove a pattern of fraudulent lending, we can petition the territorial governor for an investigation. Morrison would have to freeze all collections until it's resolved." Clara leaned forward eagerly. "What would you need?" "Testimonies from other victims. Documentation of the fraudulent practices." Sam pulled out a list. "These are names of people Morrison's forced off their land in the past 3 years. If even half of them will testify..." "They're scattered across the territory," Ethan pointed out. "It would take weeks to track them all down." "Then we'd better start now," Clara said, already standing. "I'll take the northern settlements. Ethan, you go south. Tom can manage the ranch for a few days." "You can't travel alone, it's too dangerous." "Then send one of the hands with me." They argued about it for an hour before reaching a compromise. Clara would take the northern routes with Ben, the youngest and most trustworthy of the ranch hands. Ethan would go south alone, covering more ground on horseback. They'd meet back in 5 days with whatever testimonies they could gather. "Be careful," Ethan said as Clara prepared to leave. They stood by the wagon, Ben already in the driver's seat trying not to obviously eavesdrop. "You too." She hesitated, then rose on her toes to kiss his cheek. "Come back safe." He caught her waist as she pulled away, holding her in place. "Clara, when this is over, we'll talk," she promised, "about everything." The next 5 days were the longest of Clara's life. She and Ben traveled from homestead to homestead, collecting stories of Morrison's cruelty. The Hendersons, forced to sell their farm for a quarter of its value. The Millers, who'd lost everything when Morrison changed their interest rate without notice. The Johnsons, whose daughter had been forced to work in Morrison's house to pay off a debt that never seemed to shrink. Each story made Clara angrier, more determined. She documented everything meticulously, had each person sign their statement, gathered whatever papers they'd kept. On the 3rd day, they stopped at a small homestead where a young widow named Mary Patterson lived with her 3 children. Her story was the worst yet. "Morrison came calling 2 weeks after my husband died," Mary said, her voice hollow. "Said I couldn't possibly manage the farm alone, offered to buy it for barely enough to get us back east. When I refused, he had the sheriff evict us for non-payment of taxes. Taxes my husband had already paid, but Morrison had destroyed the receipts." "Would you testify to this in court?" Clara asked gently. Mary looked at her children, playing in the dust outside. "What if Morrison comes after us again?" "He won't be able to, not if we stop him now." Mary signed the statement with a shaking hand. On the 4th night, camping under the stars, Ben finally worked up the courage to speak personally. "Mrs. Walker, can I ask you something?" "Of course, Ben." "Do you love him?" "Mr. Walker, I mean." Clara was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the fire. "I think I'm beginning to," she admitted. "Is it that obvious? The way you look at him when you think no one's watching. The way he looks at you." Ben poked at the fire with a stick. "It's nice, seeing him coming back to life. We all worried after Mrs. Margaret died, thought we might lose him too, just in a different way. He loved her very much." "He did. But that doesn't mean he can't love again. Mrs. Margaret would have wanted him to be happy. She was like that, always thinking of others first." When Clara returned to the ranch on the 5th day, she had 15 signed testimonies and a stack of supporting documents. But her triumph was short-lived. The house was too quiet. Sophie sitting on the porch with red-rimmed eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "Papa's not back yet. He was supposed to be back yesterday." Clara's blood ran cold. "Tom!" The foreman came running. "We were about to send out a search party, ma'am. His horse came back this morning without him." "Saddle my horse," Clara ordered. "And 3 others. We're leaving now." "Ma'am, it could be dangerous. My husband is out there somewhere, possibly hurt. We're going." They found him 5 miles from the southern boundary, unconscious by a creek bed with a bullet wound in his shoulder. His gun was missing, his boots gone, but he was alive. "Ethan!" Clara dropped to her knees beside him, checking his pulse. Weak but steady. The wound was at least a day old, already showing signs of infection. "We need to get him home," Tom said. "Fast." They improvised a travois, Clara riding beside it to keep Ethan stable. He drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. Once he called for Margaret. Once he called for Clara. She held his hand through both. Back at the ranch, Clara took charge. She'd helped her father with gunshot wounds before, knew what needed to be done. The bullet had to come out, the wound cleaned and stitched. "Should we get the doctor from town?" Molly asked anxiously. "No time, the infection's spreading." Clara rolled up her sleeves. "I need boiling water, clean cloths, whiskey, and my sewing kit, and laudanum if we have any." They had a small amount of laudanum, enough to dull the pain but not enough to knock Ethan out completely. He groaned as Clara probed for the bullet, his hand crushing hers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, but I have to get it out." "Clara?" His eyes focused on her briefly. "Don't let me die. Sophie needs—" "You're not dying," she said firmly. "Not on my watch." It took an hour to remove the bullet and clean the wound properly. By the end, Clara was shaking with exhaustion and stress, but the bleeding had stopped and Ethan was sleeping more peacefully. She sat beside his bed all night, monitoring his fever, forcing water and medicine down his throat when he'd take it. Sophie curled up beside her, refusing to leave her father's side. "Is he going to be okay?" the child whispered. "Yes," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "Your papa's strong. He'll pull through." "You saved him," Sophie said, "just like you said you knew medicine." "I helped. He's saving himself by fighting." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you're here. I didn't want to be at first, but now I'm glad." Clara pulled the girl closer, kissing the top of her head. "I'm glad too, sweetheart." Ethan's fever broke near dawn. His eyes opened, clear and focused, finding Clara immediately. "You look terrible," he rasped. "You look worse," she retorted, weak with relief. "What happened?" "Someone shot you. Your horse came home without you." He frowned, trying to remember. "Morrison's men. They ambushed me on the road back, took the testimonies I'd collected." Clara's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "It doesn't matter. You're alive. That's what matters." "Does it? Without those testimonies?" "We have others. I collected 15 statements, all documented. Sam can work with those." Ethan tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. "You went alone?" "With Ben. And before you start lecturing me about safety, perhaps we should discuss you riding alone through hostile territory." "That's different." "How?" "Because you're—" He stopped, seeming to realize what he'd been about to say wouldn't go over well. "I'm what? Your wife? Your partner? Or just a woman who shouldn't be taking the same risks you do?" "All of those things," he admitted. "And someone I care about. Someone I don't want to lose." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You care about me?" "Somehow, despite my best efforts not to, yes." He reached out with his good arm, cupping her face. "These past 5 days, not knowing if you were safe, then lying in that creek thinking I might die without telling you. Clara, I don't know if I can love you the way I loved Margaret, but I do know that what I feel for you is real and growing stronger every day." "I'm not asking you to love me the way you loved her," Clara said softly. "That was first love, young love. We're different people, older, with scars and losses. What we might have together would be different too, not less, just different." He pulled her down until their foreheads touched. "When did you become so wise?" "Somewhere between fighting off bankers and pulling bullets out of stubborn ranchers." He laughed, then winced as it pulled his stitches. "Don't make me laugh. Don't make me shoot you myself for scaring me like that." Sophie stirred beside them, waking to find her father conscious. "Papa!" She threw herself at him, and Clara had to catch her to prevent her from hitting his wound. "Gentle, sweetheart. Your papa's hurt." "But he's okay. He's going to be okay." "Yes," Ethan said, kissing his daughter's forehead. "Thanks to Clara." Sophie looked between them, something shifting in her young face. "Are you going to kiss her too? You kiss Mama Clara like you kissed Mama Margaret?" Both adults froze.
It was the first time Sophie had called Clara Mama without qualification. "Would that be okay with you?" Ethan asked carefully. Sophie considered this seriously. "Mama Margaret is in heaven. She can't come back. But Mama Clara is here and she takes care of us, and she makes you smile sometimes. So yes, it would be okay." Permission granted by a 6-year-old, but somehow it felt like the most important blessing they could receive. Ethan looked at Clara, question in his eyes. "Not until you're healed," she said, but she was smiling. "I don't want to hurt you." "Too late," he said softly. "You already have, in the best possible way." Over the next week, as Ethan recovered, something shifted in the household. The careful distance between husband and wife began to close. Clara still kept her own room, but she spent her evenings in Ethan's as he healed, reading aloud while Sophie played on the floor. They talked about everything and nothing: books, dreams, plans for the ranch, memories both bitter and sweet. Morrison stayed quiet, too quiet.
Sam sent word that he'd filed the testimonies with the territorial court, but it would take time for a response. Time they didn't have, with the 30-day deadline approaching. "We need a backup plan," Clara said one evening, "if the legal challenge doesn't work in time." "I won't let you write to your aunt," Ethan said firmly, "not to beg for money for my failures." "Our failures, if they are failures, and it's not begging, it's seeking investment." "Clara, no, listen. I've been thinking, what if we didn't ask for charity but offered a genuine investment opportunity? The timber rights, mineral rights, even a partnership in the cattle operation. Your pride doesn't have to be the death of this ranch." He was quiet for a long moment. "You'd do that? Bring your family into this mess?" "You're my family now," she said simply. "You and Sophie. This ranch. This is my life now, Ethan. I choose it. I choose you." He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I don't deserve you, Probably not," she agreed with a small smile. "But you're stuck with me anyway." That night she wrote 2 letters. One to her aunt in Boston, laying out a business proposition with clear terms and potential returns. The other to her father's former partner, making a similar offer. She didn't tell Ethan about the second letter, not wanting to get his hopes up. 3 days before the deadline, both responses arrived on the same day. Her aunt's refusal was curt and disapproving. The partner's acceptance was enthusiastic, with a bank draft for $4,000 and a proposal for an ongoing business relationship. Claire's hands shook as she carried the letter to Ethan, who was finally up and moving around, though still weak. "Read this," she said. He did, his eyes widening. "Clara, it's our ranch saved. It's Sophie's future secured. It's Morrison defeated. It's a miracle. It's my dowry," she corrected, "finally being put to good use." "Your what?" She smiled at his confusion. "You didn't think the daughter of a Boston doctor came west without any resources, did you?" "I've been in contact with my father's partner about accessing my inheritance. This just gave me a reason to claim it." "You've had money this whole time?" "Tied up in investments, yes. I couldn't access it without either marrying or turning 30. "Marrying you solved that problem." Ethan stared at her. "So you could have left any time, been independent." "I could have," she agreed. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped wanting to leave. I started wanting to stay, to fight for this place, for this life." She paused. "For you." He crossed to her in 2 strides, his hands framing her face. "You impossible, incredible woman." "Is that a compliment?" "It's a declaration," he said, and kissed her. It wasn't their first kiss. That had been at their wedding, brief and obligatory. This was different. This was choice and promise, and the first tentative steps toward a future neither had expected, but both were beginning to want desperately. When they broke apart, Sophie was standing in the doorway grinning. "Finally," she announced. "I thought you two would never figure it out." Clara laughed, opening her arm to include the girl in their embrace. Sometimes adults are slower than children to see what's right in front of them. "Much slower," Sophie agreed solemnly. The next morning they rode to town together, all 3 of them, to face Morrison at the bank. Clara wore her best dress, Ethan his Sunday suit, and Sophie her favorite pinafore. They looked like what they were becoming, a family united. Morrison's face went from smug to shocked to furious as Ethan counted out the full payment plus interest on his desk. "This isn't over," Morrison snarled. "Actually, it is," Sam Fletcher said, entering with Sheriff Bradley and a federal marshal. "Harold Morrison, you're under arrest for fraud, usury, and theft. We have statements from 17 victims and evidence of your criminal activities across 3 territories." As Morrison was led away in chains, still sputtering threats, Clara felt Ethan's arm come around her waist, pulling her close. "We did it," he murmured against her hair. "Together," she agreed. The weeks following Morrison's arrest brought an unexpected peace to the Double W Ranch, like the calm after a violent storm. Yet Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between her and Ethan, something deeper than their partnership against Morrison. She noticed it in small moments, the way his hand lingered on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, how his eyes sought hers across the dinner table, the smile that played at his lips when he caught her teaching Sophie in the study. One evening in early October, as golden aspens painted the mountainsides, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching Ethan work with a young colt. Sophie sat on the fence, calling out encouragement, her laughter carrying on the crisp air. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so beautifully ordinary, that Clara's heart ached with a longing she couldn't quite name. "You love him," Molly said quietly beside her. Clara didn't deny it. Is it that obvious? To everyone but him, probably. Men can be thick about these things. The older woman dried a plate thoughtfully. "Margaret would have liked you, you know. Would have been glad it was you." "You don't have to say that." "I'm not one for pretty lies, Mrs. Walker. I mean it. She worried about them those last weeks. Made me promise to help Ethan find someone strong enough to handle his stubborn nature, but gentle enough to heal Sophie's heart. Seems to me you're doing both." Before Clara could respond, Tom burst through the door, his face grave. "Mrs. Walker, we've got trouble. There's a man in town asking questions about you. Says he's from Boston, knows your family." Clara's blood ran cold. "What kind of man?" "Well-dressed, fancy talker, says his name is Charles Whitmore. Claims to be your cousin." The plate Clara was holding slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the floor. Charles. Here. The very person she'd fled Boston to escape. "Ma'am?" Tom's voice seemed to come from far away. "You all right?" "Get Ethan," she managed. "Please." Ethan found her in the study minutes later, papers spread before her, papers she'd hidden since arriving in Silver Creek. Her hands shook as she pushed them toward him. "I need to tell you something about why I really left Boston." He sat down across from her, his expression serious but open. "I'm listening." "Charles Whitmore is my cousin by marriage. When my father died and the debts were discovered, Charles offered to help. He said he'd pay everything if I..." She paused, gathering courage. "If I agreed to become his mistress." Ethan's face darkened dangerously. "He what?" "He's married, has been for 10 years. But he said he'd always wanted me, that this was my chance to save my father's reputation and have security. When I refused, he started spreading rumors that I'd been my father's assistant in more than medical matters. That I was improper with male patients. He made it impossible for me to stay in Boston. And now he's here. He must have tracked me down when I accessed my inheritance. He probably thinks..." She stopped, unable to voice her fears. "He thinks he can still claim you somehow." Ethan's voice was deadly quiet. "He's wrong." He stood, and Clara saw him check the gun at his hip. "Ethan, no. Violence won't solve this." "Maybe not, but it'll make me feel better." "Please," she caught his hand. "Let me handle this my way first. If Charles is here, he wants something. Money, probably, or just to torment me. But I'm not the same woman who ran from Boston. I have you now, and Sophie, and this place. I have ground to stand on." Ethan pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms. "You don't have to face him alone." "I know. That's what makes me brave enough to face him at all." Charles arrived at the ranch the next afternoon in a hired carriage, dressed in a black suit that probably cost more than most ranch hands made in a year. He was handsome in that polished Eastern way, smooth-featured, carefully groomed, with pale hands that had never known hard work. Clara watched from the window as he stepped down, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeves with fastidious care. "That's him?" Ethan asked beside her. "That's him. He looks like a weasel." Despite her anxiety, Clara almost smiled. "He rather does, doesn't he?" They met him on the porch. Ethan slightly behind Clara, but unmistakably present, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Charles's eyes flicked between them, taking in Ethan's protective stance, Clara's simple but neat appearance, the ranch spreading behind them. "Clara, my dear," Charles said, removing his hat with a flourish. "How rustic you've become." "Charles," she didn't invite him in. "Why are you here? Is that any way to greet family? After I've come all this way to check on your welfare?" His smile was oil slick. "When I heard you'd married so suddenly, so soon after arriving here, I was concerned. Such haste suggests desperation, doesn't it?" "Or love," Ethan said quietly, stepping forward. "You must be the cousin Clara's mentioned, the married one who propositioned her." Charles's face flushed. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Ethan Walker, Clara's husband, the real kind with vows before God and everything, not the back alley arrangement you had in mind." "How dare you? How dare I?" Ethan's voice dropped dangerously. "You drove my wife from her home with lies and slander because she wouldn't warm your bed. I'd say I'm being remarkably civil, considering." Charles's composure cracked slightly. "Clara, surely we can discuss this privately. Family business and all." "We have no business, Charles. Whatever you came for, the answer is no." "Not even to protect your father's reputation?" Charles pulled out a leather folder. "I have letters here, documents that could be interpreted in very unfortunate ways. Your father's medical practice involved some controversial treatments, especially regarding female hysteria. It would be such a shame if certain interpretations reached the newspapers." Clara felt sick, but before she could respond, Sophie appeared in the doorway. "Mama Clara, is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Clara said steadily. "Go find Mrs. O'Brien." But Sophie, with a child's instinct for tension, stayed put, moving to stand beside Clara and taking her hand. The simple gesture seemed to give Clara strength. "Publish whatever you want, Charles," she said. "My father was a good man and a brilliant doctor. His treatments were progressive, not scandalous. And even if you twist them into something ugly, it doesn't matter anymore. The people here judge me by my own actions, not Boston gossip." "You think this Frontier Nobility Act makes you better than you were?" Charles sneered. "You're still the same prideful girl who thought she was too good for what I offered." "No," Clara said firmly. "I'm not the same. That girl was alone and frightened. This woman has a husband who respects her, a daughter who's learning to love her, and a community that's accepted her. You have no power here, Charles." "We'll see about that." He turned to Ethan. "Did your wife tell you she inherited quite a fortune? Money that should have gone to settling her father's debts, debts to my family, among others. I could make a legal claim." "Try it," Sam Fletcher said, stepping around the corner of the house where he'd been listening. "I'd love to argue that case in court. A married man trying to extort money from his cousin using threats and blackmail. The territorial judge would find it very interesting." Charles spun around. "Who are you?" "The family lawyer. Also a witness to everything you just said." Sam smiled pleasantly. "I believe you were just leaving?" Charles looked between them all. Clara standing firm, Ethan protective beside her, Sophie clinging to Clara's hand, Sam with his legal authority. His scheme had depended on finding Clara isolated and vulnerable. Instead, he'd found her surrounded by family, even if it wasn't the family she'd been born to. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes, it is," Clara said. "If you come near me or my family again, if you spread one more lie about my father, if you so much as send a letter, I'll file charges for harassment and extortion. Sam has already drawn up the papers." Charles's face went white, then red. Without another word, he stalked back to his carriage, shouting at the driver to leave immediately. As the dust settled behind the departing carriage, Clara's knees gave out. Ethan caught her, guiding her to the porch swing, while Sophie climbed into her lap. "You were so brave, Mama Clara," Sophie said, "like when you stood up to Mr. Morrison." "I didn't feel brave," Clara admitted. "Bravest thing I've ever seen," Ethan said, sitting beside them. "Facing down your past like that." "Our past,"
Clara corrected. He threatened our family, our life here. That made it easier to be strong. Sam cleared his throat. If you need me to follow through on any legal action... I don't think he'll be back, Clara said. Charles is a coward at heart. He only attacks when he thinks he'll win easily. After Sam left and Sophie went to help Molly with dinner, Ethan and Clara sat alone on the swing, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. You called us your family, Ethan said quietly. Aren't you? I suppose we are. Legally, anyway. Is that all? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, holding out his hand. Come with me. He led her to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, where Margaret lay beneath a simple stone marker. Clara had avoided this place, feeling like an intruder. Now Ethan drew her forward until they stood before the grave. Margaret, he said quietly, this is Clara. I think you'd like her. She's nothing like you. She's prickly where you were sweet, logical where you were intuitive, careful where you were spontaneous. But she loves Sophie, and she's saved this ranch, and she makes me want to live again instead of just survive. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Ethan continued, I'll always love you. You were my first everything, first love, first loss, first lesson that hearts can hold more than one truth at a time. But I'm falling in love with Clara too, and I need you to know that it doesn't diminish what we had. It's just different. He turned to Clara, cupping her face in his calloused hands. I love you, Clara Whitmore Walker. Not instead of Margaret, but alongside her memory. Not as a replacement, but as yourself. Can that be enough? Clara was crying openly now. It's everything, she whispered. He kissed her then, there in the cemetery with the ghosts of the past as witnesses, and it felt like benediction and beginning all at once. When they broke apart, a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, crying once before disappearing into the sunset. Margaret loved hawks, Ethan said softly, said they were freedom itself. They walked back to the house hand in hand, finding Sophie and Molly setting the table for dinner. It looked so normal, so domestic, but Clara saw it with new eyes. This wasn't just a house she was staying in or a child she was caring for. This was home. This was family. This was hers. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Clara found herself standing in the hallway between her room and Ethan's. They'd kissed goodnight at her door, sweet and lingering, but she sensed his hesitation to push for more. Clara? His door opened, and he stood there in his nightshirt and trousers, obviously unable to sleep either. I don't want to be alone tonight, she admitted. Not after everything. Would that be all right? He held out his hand in answer, drawing her into his room. Their room now, she supposed. The bed where he'd grieved alone for so many months suddenly seemed like a place of possibility rather than sorrow. They lay facing each other in the moonlight, not touching at first, just looking. Clara saw the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines that grief and weather had carved around his eyes, the scar on his chin from some long-ago accident. He wasn't handsome in Charles's polished way, but he was real and solid in hers. I'm scared, she admitted. Of what? Of being happy. Of believing this is real. Of losing it all. He reached out, tracing her cheekbone with one finger. I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise to face it with you. Together. Together, she echoed and closed the distance between them. Their coming together was gentle and tentative, two people who'd been broken learning to be whole again. Ethan was patient, reverent, treating her body like something precious. Clara had expected to feel like a substitute, but instead she felt cherished for exactly who she was. Afterward, they lay entwined, Clara's head on Ethan's chest, listening to his heartbeat. I didn't think I'd ever have this again, he murmured into her hair. Have what? Peace, contentment, hope for tomorrow. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Love. They talked through the night, sharing stories they'd held back before. Clara told him about growing up as a doctor's daughter, the joy of learning medicine, the patients she'd helped save. Ethan shared memories of his childhood on a small farm in Ohio, his decision to come west, meeting Margaret at a barn dance, and knowing within minutes she was the one. Do you believe in fate? Clara asked as dawn approached. I didn't.
thought life was just random chance and choice. But now, he pulled her closer. What are the odds that Morrison's schemes would bring together two broken people who happened to be exactly what each other needed? When you put it that way, it does seem unlikely. Or inevitable. Maybe Margaret and your father are up there somewhere, conspiring. Clara smiled at the thought. My father would have liked you, would have appreciated your honesty and your work ethic. And Margaret would have admired your strength and intelligence. They fell silent as the room lightened, comfortable in their closeness. Then Sophie's voice called from downstairs. Papa? Mama Clara? Breakfast. I suppose we should get up, Clara said, though she made no move to leave his arms. In a minute, Ethan said, kissing her again. Let me be selfish for just another minute. But it was several minutes before they rose, dressed, and went down to face the day as what they'd finally become. Truly husband and wife. The next months passed in a blur of happiness Clara had never expected to find. The ranch prospered with the investment money, allowing them to expand the herd and start the orchard Clara had envisioned. Sophie began calling her mama without qualification, and Clara taught her reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic medicine with equal enthusiasm. The first test of their new happiness came in November when Clara realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks but hadn't wanted to say anything until she was certain. The morning she finally told Ethan, his reaction wasn't what she expected. He went completely still, the color draining from his face. Pregnant? Yes. Due in late spring, I think. She touched his arm. Ethan, what's wrong? Margaret died in childbirth, he said hoarsely. She bled, and nothing I did could stop it. Clara, I can't lose you too. She pulled him into her arms, holding him as he shook. You won't. I won't let that happen. You can't promise that. No, she admitted, but I know more about childbirth than most. I assisted my father with dozens of deliveries. I know the danger signs, what to watch for, and we'll get the best midwife in the territory when the time comes. I'm scared, he admitted against her shoulder. So am I, but we're stronger together than apart, remember? They didn't tell Sophie immediately, wanting to be sure the pregnancy would continue, but children have ways of knowing things, and by December, Sophie was asking pointed questions about why Mama Clara was tired all the time and couldn't stand the smell of bacon. Are you sick? Sophie asked one morning, finding Clara bent over the wash basin. Not exactly sick, Clara managed. Sophie's eyes went wide. Are you going to have a baby? Clara and Ethan exchanged glances. How did you know that? Ethan asked. Tommy's mama was like this before his little sister came. She said it was called morning sickness, but that was silly because it happened all day. Yes, Clara said carefully. There's going to be a baby in the spring. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and Clara's heart sank. Of course the child would feel threatened. She'd already lost one mother, now she might feel like she was losing her place in this new family. Will you still love me? Sophie asked in a small voice. When you have your own baby? Clara knelt awkwardly, pulling Sophie close. Oh, sweetheart, you are my own. You're my daughter in every way that matters. This baby will be your brother or sister, but you'll always be my first child, the one who taught me how to be a mother. Really? Really. And you know what? This baby is going to need a big sister to teach them everything. How to gather eggs without getting pecked, how to ride a horse, how to be brave. Do you think you could do that? Sophie straightened, responsibility settling on her small shoulders. I could do that. I'd be a good big sister. The best, Ethan agreed, pulling them both into his embrace. As winter settled over the ranch, Clara's pregnancy progressed normally despite Ethan's constant worry. He watched her like a hawk, insisting she rest more, eat more, avoid any strain. It was both touching and occasionally infuriating. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she told him one January morning when he tried to prevent her from carrying a bucket of water. Humor me, he said, taking the bucket. I need to feel like I'm doing something to keep you safe. She softened, understanding his fear. I'm being careful. I promise. The real surprise came in February when Sam Fletcher visited with unexpected news. Charles Whitmore is dead, he announced without preamble. Clara sank into a chair. How? Shot by a husband who found him in a compromising position with his wife, Apparently your cousin had a habit of pursuing women who couldn't easily refuse him. This time he chose wrong. Clara felt nothing, or perhaps too many things to sort out. Relief, certainly, a touch of sorrow for the waste of a life. But mostly, she felt free. The last tie to her old life, the last threat to her new happiness, was gone. There's more, Sam continued. He never changed his will after his wife left him last year. You're named as a beneficiary, a substantial sum actually. Guilt money, I'd guess, for what he did to your father's reputation. I don't want it, Clara said immediately. Think about it, Sam urged. It could secure your children's education, expand the ranch further. Don't let pride prevent you from taking what could benefit your family. After Sam left, Clara and Ethan discussed it late into the night. Finally, Clara decided to accept the inheritance but put it entirely toward the community, building a proper schoolhouse, establishing a lending library, creating a fund for families hit by hardship. Turn his selfishness into something good, she said. That's the best revenge. March brought unexpected snowstorms and the news that Clara was carrying twins. The traveling doctor who confirmed it looked grave as he delivered the news, and Ethan went white as snow. Twins increase the risk, the doctor said bluntly. You should consider going to Denver for the delivery, where there are hospitals. No, Clara said firmly. This ranch is my home. My children will be born here. After the doctor left, Ethan was nearly beside himself. Clara, please. If something goes wrong, then we'll handle it. Together. I won't be driven from my home by fear. She was stronger than she sounded. Twins did increase the danger, and she was no longer young for a first pregnancy. But she also knew her body, knew the signs to watch for, and had already arranged for the best midwife in 3 counties to come stay at the ranch for the last month. April arrived with meadowlarks and wildflowers, and Clara was enormous. Moving was difficult, sleeping nearly impossible, but she remained stubbornly cheerful, much to everyone's amazement. How are you not miserable? Molly asked, watching Clara lower herself carefully into a chair. Oh, I'm miserable, Clara admitted. But I'm also happy. These babies are proof that life goes on, that families can be rebuilt after loss. How can I not be grateful for that? The midwife, a German woman named Greta, who delivered hundreds of babies, arrived in mid-April. She examined Clara thoroughly and pronounced her healthy, though she pulled Ethan aside for a private word that left him even more anxious. What did she say? Clara demanded. That twins are tricky, that we should be prepared for anything. We are prepared. We have everything ready. She means prepared to lose you, Ethan said rawly. I can't do this again, Clara. I can't. She pulled him down beside her on the bed, holding his face between her hands. Look at me. Really look at me. I'm strong. These babies are strong. We're going to be fine. You don't know that? No, but I believe it. And sometimes faith is all we have. The pains started at dawn on April 23rd. Clara had been expecting them. She'd had minor contractions for days. But these were different, stronger, more purposeful. It's time, she told Ethan calmly. What followed were the longest 18 hours of Ethan's life. Clara labored with determined grace, walking when she could, resting when she must. Sophie was sent to stay with the Hendersons, but not before giving Clara a fierce hug. You come back, Sophie ordered. You and the babies, promise. I promise, Clara said, praying she could keep her word. As the hours passed and Clara grew exhausted, Ethan's fear grew. But Clara remained focused, working with her body rather than against it, using everything she'd learned from years of assisting her father. First one's coming, Greta announced as the sun began to set. The first twin, a boy, arrived with a lusty cry that brought tears of relief to Ethan's eyes. But there was no time to celebrate. The second baby was coming fast. It's turned wrong, Greta said tersely. I need to adjust, Claire screamed for the first time, and Ethan thought his heart would stop. But Greta's skilled hands worked quickly, and 20 minutes later, a second cry filled the room. A girl, smaller than her brother, but fierce in her announcement of arrival. 2 healthy babies, Greta announced with satisfaction, and a healthy mother, though she'll need rest and care. Ethan was crying openly as he held his son while Clara cradled their daughter. They're perfect, he whispered. They look like you, Clara said weakly but happily. Poor things. He laughed through his tears. What should we name them? They'd discussed names for weeks, but now, looking at their children, Clara knew. William for him, after your father, and Rose for her. Rose? Ethan was puzzled. For the wild roses on the hill where you told me you loved me, where past and present came together. Sophie was brought home the next morning to meet her siblings. She approached the bed cautiously, peering at the bundles in Clara's arms. They're so small, she whispered. You were this small once, Ethan told her. Really? Sophie reached out tentatively to touch Rose's tiny fist. The baby gripped her finger and Sophie's face lit with wonder. She's holding me. She knows you're her big sister, Clara said. She knows you'll protect her. Both of them, Sophie said firmly. I'll protect both of them and teach them everything, how to ride and read and make medicine and be brave. All the important things, Clara agreed. As the family adjusted to life with twins, the ranch community rallied around them. Women brought food and offered advice. Men helped Ethan with the ranch work so he could spend more time at home. It was, Clara realized, exactly what she'd fled Boston to find, a place where neighbors were family and family was everything. One evening in May, as Clara sat in the rocking chair nursing Rose while Ethan held William and Sophie read aloud from one of her new books, Clara felt a profound sense of completion. This wasn't the life she'd planned or expected. She'd thought she'd be a spinster teacher, alone but independent. Instead, she was a wife, mother to 3 children, partner in a thriving ranch. What are you thinking? Ethan asked, noticing her contemplative mood. About how Morrison's cruelty led to our happiness, how my disgrace in Boston brought me here, how your loss made room for our love. It seems wrong to be grateful for such terrible things, but without them, we wouldn't have this, Ethan finished. I know, I've thought the same. Margaret used to say everything happened for a reason. I didn't believe her then, but now you do? Now I think maybe there's something to it, or maybe we just make meaning from chaos. Either way, I'm grateful. Sophie looked up from her book. Are you talking about mushy stuff again? Very mushy, Clara confirmed. Does it bother you? No, Sophie said, returning to her reading. It's nice, like we're a real family now. We are a real family, Ethan said firmly. The realest, Sophie agreed, making them all laugh. That night, after the children were asleep, Ethan and Clara stood on the porch watching the stars. The ranch spread before them, peaceful in the moonlight. In the distance, a coyote called, but it no longer sounded lonely to Clara. It sounded like wildness and freedom and home. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked. Coming west, marrying me? Never, Clara said without hesitation. This life, this family, you, it's everything I never knew I wanted. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of hay and leather and him. They'd traveled such a strange, difficult road to reach this moment, forced together by schemes and circumstances, held apart by grief and fear, brought together by courage and choice. I love you, she said, the words still feeling like a miracle she was allowed to speak. And I love you, he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. Inside, one of the twins cried, and they smiled at each other before going in to tend to their child. This was their life now, not perfect, not without challenges, but theirs, built on the ashes of loss, strengthened by adversity, and blessed with love neither had expected to find. As Clara picked up William and soothed him while Ethan checked on Rose, she thought about the woman she'd been that terrible day at the altar, being forced to marry a stranger. That woman had been terrified, certain she was entering a prison. She'd had no idea she was actually stepping into her future, into a love story that would prove sometimes the best things come from the worst beginnings. Thank you, she whispered to whatever force had orchestrated this unlikely happiness. To Margaret, perhaps, for loving Ethan first and teaching him to love deeply. To her father, for giving her the strength and skills to fight for what mattered. To Morrison, ironically, for forcing 2 stubborn hearts together. And to Ethan, for choosing to let love grow again despite his fear. The baby settled, and Clara returned him to his cradle. Across the room, Ethan had Rose against his shoulder, swaying gently and humming a lullaby Clara recognized, one Margaret had probably sung to Sophie. But it didn't hurt to hear it. This wasn't about replacing or forgetting. It was about continuing, about love being big enough to hold past and present, memory and hope, loss and joy. "Come to bed," Ethan said softly. "Tomorrow will be here soon enough." She took his offered hand, and together they walked to their room, leaving the door cracked so they could hear if the children needed them. As they settled into bed, Clara pressed close to Ethan's warmth, marveling at how natural this felt now. "Tell me something," she said into the darkness. "What?" "If you could go back, knowing everything, would you still marry me that day?" He was quiet for a moment, then turned to face her in the moonlight. "I'd marry you sooner. I'd waste less time fighting it. I'd tell Morrison thank you instead of cursing him." He traced her face with gentle fingers. "Would you?" "Yes," she said simply. 1,000 times yes." They kissed, soft and sweet, a promise renewed. Outside, the wind picked. "Thank you, truly. Thank you for staying until the very last moments of this story. In this vast world, each of us walks our own journey. There are days as peaceful as sunlight resting on an open field. And there are also days when storms arrive without warning, like a cold wind in the middle of summer. And sometimes, just like Ethan and Clara, we find ourselves pushed onto paths we never chose. At those moments, we may think that life is closing a door on us, but strangely enough, sometimes the very door that seems to close is the one that leads us somewhere we never dared to dream of. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is not that they defeated those who tried to take their land, nor is it the moment they stood up against injustice. The most beautiful thing is the way two people carrying deep wounds in their hearts still chose to stay, chose to trust, and little by little learned how to open their hearts again. Because sometimes love does not arrive during the brightest days of our lives. It comes after loss. After the long days when it feels like there is nothing left to hope for, it arrives quietly, like a small seed falling into the soil after a long winter. At first, we do not notice it. Then one day, we suddenly see a tiny green sprout and realize that life is still continuing to grow. Perhaps that is also what life is always trying to remind us. That human beings can be hurt, can lose things that matter deeply, can be forced to begin again in circumstances that are far from fair. But the human heart is strange in a beautiful way. It does not only know how to feel pain, it also knows how to heal. Ethan once believed that his heart had closed forever along with his past. Clara once thought that life had decided she would always stand on the edge of happiness, never truly part of it. Yet in the end, the very people who believed they had lost everything were the ones who found a family, renewed faith, and a future they had never dared to imagine. Perhaps life is like that for all of us. Sometimes things happen that make us believe we have reached the end of our story. But sometimes it is only the middle chapter, a difficult chapter, a chapter filled with tears, yet also a chapter that is necessary so that we can meet the people who will walk beside us through the rest of the journey. And who knows, right now, somewhere in your life, something just like that may already be beginning to grow. A new opportunity, a new person entering your life, a hope you have not yet recognized. If life feels heavy today, remember that even the coldest winter cannot stop spring from returning. And sometimes the most beautiful things in life are not the ones we carefully chose, but the ones we had the courage to stay and build, day by day. Little by little, thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for sharing these quiet moments with people who walked through loss and still found the light. I hope that when this video ends, you will feel just a little lighter and carry with you a little more faith that no matter where life leads you, there will always come a day when you look back and realize the most beautiful beginnings in life sometimes begin from what we once believed was the end.